Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was standing in the backyard with my phone up because the sky was stupidly clear that night. No moon, a cool wind off the hills, Orion straight overhead. I like taking pictures of the stars when the weather cooperates. It's calming, a stupid hobby for someone who spends his days staring at spreadsheets. I propped my elbow on the fence, framed a shot of the 3 bright stars that make Orion's belt, and tapped the shutter. When the photo finished, my neighbor's dog started whining like it does when someone walks by the house, high and persistent. The sound felt wrong in the open night. Usually it's a staccato bark. I turned and called out, but the dog didn't stop. Karen from next door must have come out because I heard her mutter and the soft click of a porch light she keeps on at night. She flicked it off after a minute. The dog quieted down immediately. I scrolled through the photos to check focus. The belt looked perfect. 3 tiny white points lined up cleanly. But when I swiped left, I nearly knocked over my coffee because the next image was not the sky. It was the same patch of stars, but with a dark shape covering most of the frame. A heavy, disc-like shadow blotched the photo. Edges soft but definite. Stars that were obvious in the first shot were gone where the shadow sat. I'd just been looking at that spot with my own eyes. There was nothing there. No cloud, no contrail, nothing that should have made a silhouette. I stared until my eyes blurred, thumb hovering over the screen. The phone's display made the shadow look almost tactile, like an oil spill on glass. I tapped the photo to zoom in. The stars around the dark area were still pinpricks. The shadow didn't smear them. It simply hid them cleanly, like a hand raised between a bulb and your eyes. I felt stupid. Phones do weird things. The camera can ghost or overexpose. Maybe a smudge on the lens. I pulled the phone away, checked the glass. Clean. I blew on it just in case and took another photo of the same patch. The result, a perfect field of stars. I took 3 more pictures in quick succession. Each one was the sky as I had seen it, bright and uninterrupted. So if it was an artifact, and it could have been, why did only one photo have that massive shadow? Why had the dog started whining and Karen switched off the porch light right before I took the second picture? Why did the air feel a little denser, like right before heavy rain when there wasn't a cloud in sight? I told myself to be reasonable. I have a cheap phone, cheap lens, cheap senses at midnight. I texted a picture to my buddy Tom and asked if he could look at it tomorrow. I put the phone in my pocket and kept walking the yard to cool off. The dog was calm, Karen's house was dark, and a small plane droned in the distance as it usually does. The night was ordinary, and that eased something in me. The ordinary didn't hold long. While I was tossing the coffee in the sink, the kitchen radio clicked and dropped the station for a half second, just a stutter. When it came back, the song was a few beats behind where it should have been, like it had hiccuped and resumed. The microwave clock had jumped by a minute. I caught myself checking all the digital clocks in the house, and they didn't agree for a moment. My phone showed 11:08, the wall clock 11:07, the oven 11:09. Nothing extreme, but just enough to feel wrong. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept picturing the photo, the way the shadow had sat there without any fringe or glowword. In the morning, I tried to rationalize with evidence. I loaded the image onto my laptop and zoomed in at full resolution. The shadow was still there, cropping out a cluster of faint background stars. Photoshop didn't reveal anything obvious. No double exposure, no lens flare. I checked metadata. The file timestamp matched the minute I'd taken it. Everything about the file was ordinary, except what the file contained. I drove over to Karen's that afternoon and mentioned the dog and the light. She squinted at me out the window like I'd suggested a raccoon stole her socks. He barked, yeah? She said slowly. About 11. Sounded weird. I switched the light because I didn't like him whining out there. It calmed him. She looked up at the sky. You see anything? I told her no, not then. She shrugged and said she'd been inside making tea. No one had seen anything except the dog and her porch light. On the way home, I stopped at the little park across from my place because it's easier to look at the sky from open ground. I walked the gravel path and tried to recreate what I'd seen with the eye versus what the camera had captured. The spot I'd photographed made no sense. Empty heavens. I pointed my phone up and snapped another sequence of images, all clean. I took long exposures with the phone's night mode. Each exposure painted the sky in streaks the way long shots do when the camera picks up the Earth's rotation. No shadows. That made it worse, not better. If whatever had been there was transient and only the camera caught it, why did it look so complete in the file? Why did the shadow have a rim, however soft, as though a three-dimensional object had blocked starlight? You'd expect a cloud to blur the points. You'd expect lens smudges to smear. But this was a clean cutout. My rational brain kept circling back to mechanical explanations. Lens smear, software glitch, compression artifact. And when nothing fit, I felt smaller, like something in my experience had been bumped and I was the only one who noticed. Tom texted back that afternoon, "Nice shot. Heavy negative space." He always jokes like that. I sent the image to another friend who runs a small amateur astronomy club. He replied with a string of questions about exposure and ISO. I answered as best I could. He wrote, "Weird. If it were a cloud, it should show up across a sequence. If it's a bird too close, it'll show motion blur." He was generous. He said maybe a bat in front of the lens, maybe. I smiled at the bat idea and then deleted the smile because the shadow had been way too large for a bat. The next week, I checked the sky whenever I could, kept the habit of taking a couple of photos, and most nights they were just sky. Every now and then, I'd look up and feel like someone else had been looking too. A small, polite pressure at the edge of perception, an idea that I was being watched without being stared at. You can tell yourself that's paranoia, but it's a particular kind of paranoia that comes from noticing a detail in the corners of your life and having no comfortable place to put it. A month after that first photo, I printed it and put the print into an old wooden box in a top drawer. Not because I believed it meant anything, but because there was a part of me that liked the record. If the world is mostly ordinary, then small oddities are how you feel your life's texture. The photographs sat there with my passport renewal form and a few other inexplicable things. A receipt for a sandwich I don't remember buying, a key that fit nothing I owned, and it felt like the right place. People ask why I didn't call someone. The paper, the university, the police. Who do you tell about a shadow in a star photo and not sound like you need sleep? I showed it to the astronomy club friend in person once, and he whistled, impressed and non-committal. "Camera caught something you didn't," he said. "Could be interesting, could be nothing. Either way, keep shooting." So I did. I still go into the yard some nights with the same cheap phone, the same habit. Most photos are clean. Every so often I take another shot that shows nothing with my own eyes, but something else in the frame on the file. Not always the same shape. Not always obvious. Sometimes just a darker band like sky painted with a broad brush. Sometimes nothing at all. I don't sleep under the stars anymore because I don't need another excuse to look up at a night and worry that my camera will see more than I do. But I keep that one photo in the drawer, and when I need to remind myself of the world's small edges, the places ordinary life doesn't explain, I pull it out. The disc sits there in the paper's grain, heavy and mute. I don't have an answer for it. I don't even have a plan. It's just one more image I took on a clear night that didn't match what my eyes had seen, and the fact of it has stuck with me in a way that no spreadsheet ever did. I hadn't planned on staying out late. I went down to Blue Water Lake because Mason's kid had his baseball game canceled and he couldn't get off work to go, and I needed the quiet. I've been going to that little cove for years with a Coleman lantern, a cheap rod that never catches much, and an old aluminum skiff that leaks in one spot if I don't bail it. It's not a complicated ritual. Set out at dusk, sit, watch the dark come in over the trees, listen to the water, and keep the problems of the week small by comparison. That night was warm and humid, the kind of heat that makes the air feel slow. The highway a few miles away hummed faintly through the trees, but once you're 100 yards off the boat ramp, it blurs into a background drone you hardly notice. I pushed the skiff out myself because Mason wasn't there to help. There was a thin mist rising off the surface as I rowed toward the center of the cove. I joked to myself about being a cliché, old man in a boat, cheap rod, the whole routine, but it was exactly what I wanted. Nothing to think about except how my bobber sat in the water. I set the lantern on the stern and clipped the fishing light to the pole. It's not bright, just enough to see the line and a little circle of water. The sky over the lake was clear, a few scattered clouds to the west and a thicket of stars overhead. Everything was ordinary for nearly an hour. Frogs called from the cattails, a heron materialized and stalked along the far bank, and once a raccoon nosed the shore like a late-night prowler and then disappeared. The skiff creaked and I hummed off-key to the radio that I'd tuned in before I left the ramp. Country station, weak but steady. I didn't expect much from the night and got exactly what I wanted. The first odd thing happened around 10:30. The frogs stopped. It wasn't a gradual quieting. One moment they were doing their usual chorus, the next, the sound cut off as if someone had snapped a switch. The silence was loud enough that I heard the chain on the anchor clink against metal. I looked up, and the sky was the same. The moon had sunk lower, but the stars were sharp. I told myself the frogs had gone to sleep, or that a predator had worked the bank, but there was no movement along the reeds. That little unnatural quiet sat with me. I trailed my hand in the water to keep from thinking too much. The surface was glassy where my hand passed through it. A faint warmth rose off the water, like you get after a hot day when the surface keeps clinging to heat. The radio sputtered and then cleared. The song stuttered for a beat and resumed at the right place, which was the kind of mundane little glitch you expect with a weak signal. I laughed at that one, because it's easier to laugh than to feel the hair rise along the back of your neck. A second odd detail, the insects. Usually on nights like that, the air is thick with moths and gnats, especially at the edge of the lantern light. That night, there were almost none. I saw the occasional moth flap by the lantern, a lazily looping silhouette, but the cloud of tiny winged things that usually hangs just off the surface of the water never showed. It felt like someone had swept the air clean. I baited the hook with a nightcrawler and threw the line out. Nothing. The bobber sat there, patient, while crickets from the distant bank resumed a soft rustle. I watched the capillaries of currents by the reeds as a breeze feathered them. Then, without any sound at all, a band of white light came down through the sky and struck the surface of the lake maybe 30 yards from me. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. I'm not good at technical optical descriptions. My first thought was beam, because you immediately think that way. But it wasn't a spotlight from a plane or a flashlight on a pole. There was no source I could see. The white column appeared to fall out of the sky and pierce the water like a knife. Where it hit, the lake lit up from within, as if the water itself had become a shallow, unblinking star. Tiny something, fish perhaps, jerked away from the column, a ripple of motion, and I was sure for a heartbeat I heard the soft slap of something moving below the surface. But that could have been my own breathing feeding me an idea. There was no sound, no motor, no mechanical hiss, nothing. The radio didn't change, the heron on the far bank didn't startle, and the night felt wrapped in a bubble where only the light existed. The column lasted maybe 2 or 3 seconds. I counted them, because that's what you do when your brain wants numbers and facts, as if counting might anchor the moment to sanity. Then the white light folded up on itself and vanished. The water went dull again. The frogs remained silent. My first reaction was practical disbelief. Maybe someone down on the far shore had a flashlight and some angle that made it look like the beam came from the sky. But I had the whole arc of the trees between me and any shore, and the angle didn't line up with anything human-made I could imagine. I scanned the horizon, no flash, no plane, no helicopter. Just the usual traitorous light from the highway way off in the distance. After the beam faded, a thin mist seemed to thicken for a minute, hugging the surface. It smelled like the lake itself. Wet algae and old bark, not that metallic smell some people say accompanies strange lights. I sat very still because moving felt like the wrong thing to do. What if my motion broke whatever thread of reality had made that column? The radio hummed its way through a commercial. Somewhere far off, a dog started to bark. A deep, honest noise that made the silence feel normal again. I reeled in the line and checked the hook. Clean. No bite marks. Nothing on it. I snapped photos with my phone because it's muscle memory now. When something strange happens, you take a picture, even if you don't expect it to show anything useful. The screen showed what I remembered. A patch of glassy water where the beam had been, and nothing in the photo but the lantern's ring of light. The images didn't capture the column. That disappointed me in a minor, childish way. It also made the event feel private, as if it had been arranged for me alone, and cameras were politely excluded. I thought about calling Mason, but what do you say? Hey, you free to come out? A light came down and poked the water. So I did what men with boats and nothing else to do often do. I drank cheap thermos coffee and tried to talk myself down. I rowed toward the spot at a slow, deliberate pace, each stroke careful so I wouldn't make waves. As I approached the place, the water had flashed. The surface looked colder. A skin of chill glossed across it. The frayed grass at the edge of the cove was still, no wave, no disturbance, no floating debris, nothing. The oars dipped and the boat barely moved. Another small thing happened then, one of those details that sticks in your head oddest later. The fish that sometimes break the surface, the bass that slurp flies when the light's right. They didn't. For those last few minutes, the lake behaved like a pond that's held its breath. No fish, no bugs, no frogs. The world had tightened in on a single event and then loosened again, leaving a pocket of emptiness. I pulled the skiff back toward the ramp and motored slowly, testing the old outboard because I didn't want it to fail with the dock still a ways off. It sounded normal enough, a tired cough and a steady beat. When I tied up and carried my gear up the slope, the town lights beyond the trees looked the same as always. Steady, indifferent. The dog from the neighbor's yard was quiet. The highway was its distant mole-hilled hum. I didn't tell anyone that night. I drove home with the windows down because the air felt fresher than it had when I left, and the fan on the dash didn't rattle like it usually does when it's been off for a while. I went to bed at midnight and lay there replaying the beam in my head until sleep took what was left of my attention. In the morning, the lake was a talking thing again. Cars in the parking lot, kids at the ramp, froth of ordinary life. I thought about mentioning it to the man at the bait shop. He's the kind of guy who hears everything and sorts it into categories, and I wanted that sorting. I realized I didn't want it sorted. Part of me liked holding the thing private, a small unshared oddness that made the water feel less like a commodity and more like a place with edges. It's been a couple of weeks. I still go out some nights when I can. The frogs have been a little thin where they used to be loud, and once I noticed, a week after, an odd ring of bubbles clustered where the beam had hit. They disappeared by morning. Mason asked if I'd caught anything. I told him the honest answer, no, but I'd seen something beautiful and strange, and I didn't know whether to square it away with explanation or keep it as a plain, private, not quite anecdote. I sleep fine most nights now. I keep the boat at the ramp, the lantern in the corner of the garage, and the thermos where I can reach it. I don't expect any more lights to come down. If they do, I'll row out and watch, because at some point I decided I prefer the uneasy truth of a thing seen to the tidy nothing of a thing omitted. For now, the lake is back to being just a lake, and I'm content with how impossibly small and solid that is. I was driving home late from a double shift at the clinic. The kind of night where your brain is fogged and your body keeps telling you to stop and sleep, but your car keeps going anyway. It was a Thursday. Fog rolling in off the ocean, thicker than it usually does this time of year. Low, wet, smelling of kelp and diesel. And the stretch of road I take is mostly empty between the town and the small subdivision where Anna and I rent a place. I know the turns by muscle memory. Past the gas station, under the broken streetlight, through a pair of tight curves where the cliffs come close to the road. I like that route because it's quiet and short, and the ocean is somewhere over your left shoulder the whole way, a black suggestion you can't actually see. The first odd thing was nothing dramatic. My radio, which usually grumbles between stations at that hour, went completely silent for a few minutes and then popped back on with the same song I'd been listening to, like nothing had happened. The song didn't sound weird. It was just there, like a tape that had briefly been restarted. I shrugged it off. The fog made everything weird. Headlights looked like halos, signs spattered with moisture. I kept my speed down. A couple of miles in, a flock of birds rose up off the guardrail and scattered across the road in perfect low bursts. They didn't make a sound. Usually at least one of them would give a terrified chirp as it took off. That night they moved almost silently, and seeing them disappear into the wet air without sound gave me a small prickle along my forearms. I told myself it was a late migrating flock, nothing more. People who live near the water get used to odd animal behavior. They adapt. The fog tightened as I approached the overlook, where you can see the headlight reflections on the spray if a truck's headed the other way. A man in a reflective jacket had been standing on that turnout every week since the new cable guardrail went up. I assumed he was a contractor checking bolts, but tonight the turnout was empty. I passed his usual spot and thought, not for the first time, that the coast is full of people you see a few times and then they're gone. My phone, which I use mostly as a GPS and for the occasional podcast, had the map app open. The car's dash GPS does the same trick, but the phone is handier when the dashboard blurs in the damp. The map looked normal, my little blue dot rounding the curve, the road a thin gray vein. Then, for a breath, the dot jumped. It leapt off the road and blinked out over an expanse of deep blue where the map showed nothing but ocean. The app did an odd recalculation, the sort of silly little animation it makes when you take an unplanned turn, and for a second the screen showed my car floating somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. I laughed out loud at first, just because the absurdity of it broke the tension. The dot sat in open water, a tiny, ridiculous speck amid a wide swath of navy pixels. There were no land masses near it, no tiny icons of boats or platforms, just empty map. The app labeled the point with latitude and longitude, and an estimate that I was, according to the phone, about 3 miles offshore at 45 miles per hour. Panic didn't show up as the cinematic thing you see in movies. It was smaller and colder, a tightening behind my sternum, a sudden awareness of how loud the heater sounded, how soft the seatbelt felt. I glanced at the rear view. The road behind me was a ribbon, headlights far off in the fog, no overturned cars, no emergency vehicles, nothing that would explain a navigation glitch that massive. I tapped the screen. The map lit up and snapped back to the road. My blue dot popped into position again, centered in the lane where my headlights painted the white line. The whole thing took maybe 3 seconds. In the real world, my car hadn't moved. My hand was still on the steering wheel in exactly the way it had been. The radio still stumbled between stations as if nothing else had happened. Still, I slowed, gradually, in that way you do when you want to look like you're being cautious and not like you're holding on to the brake for a dumb reason. The fog made everything haloed and the cliffside side smelled of salt and rust. I thought about calling the clinic, telling someone to meet me, to put a sign out by the old oak, but that felt like escalating something that might be a phone app glitch. I dismissed it as that, a GPS blip, satellites losing lock for a second in tricky terrain. Mobile reception on that stretch is flaky. It could have been the phone, it could have been the weather, and then 2 miles later, the phone did it again. This time the map animation was worse. The blue dot peeled off the road and accelerated into open ocean, then stuttered like a broken steam engine and stopped dead in a blank, featureless patch of map. For an instant, the app overlaid a rectangular dialog box that is supposed to say, recalculating route. Instead, it showed a set of coordinates and an altitude field. Altitude. The idea of altitude on an app I used to find my way home was a ridiculous misfit, like seeing a snow line in a desert. My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles white under the thin driving gloves, because the phone wasn't just making noise now, it was suggesting another reality. I pulled onto the shoulder, more abrupt this time, and killed the engine. Fog pressed against the windshield like breath. Every stray sound was amplified. A far-off gull, the steady thump of my own heart. The phone screen stayed alive, displaying that absurd ocean dot, like a photograph of a lie. I tapped the app until it closed, then reopened it. The map was normal. The blue dot was back on the road. GPS satellites, I thought. Software. Settings. I went through the motions, turned the app off, toggled location services, looked at the phone system time, checked for updates. Everything appeared normal. Battery at 63%, 2 bars of signal, no warnings, no error messages. After a couple of minutes, I started the car and eased back into traffic. The world returned to smaller strangenesses. An old cat slinking across the outside lane that would have normally darted away into someone's yard, but instead kept to the edge of the asphalt like it had a reason to be there. The streetlight at the second corner, the one that usually flickers, was steady and bright. The one after that was dim, as if someone had nudged a dial between the poles. My watch buzzed, a calendar reminder I'd set that morning, and its time matched the stove clock in the house. The phone's map didn't misbehave again. When I pulled into our driveway, Anna was at the window, sleeves rolled up, mug in hand, small, domestic relief. She asked me if the clinic had been busy. I told her it had, and then because I knew she'd ask and because it reflects how we share small anxieties, I held the phone up and showed her the last bit of the map where the app had briefly pictured me in the water. She laughed a little, because that's what she does to steady me. GPS is weird, she said. Maybe your phone's just drunk. We both laughed, and I felt a part of the tension slide away. I wiped the phone screen, set it on the counter, and we went to bed. The next morning, I pulled up the location history in the map app because part of me wanted proof, a clean explanation. The app showed my entire route, the gas station, the 2 curves, that turnout where the contractor usually stands, then a continuous line into the driveway. No ocean dips, no sudden coordinates. I checked the phone's system log and the diagnostics. Nothing flagged. The car's dash computer, which records speed and engine data, showed the same. Continuous drive. No stops except the one where I'd pulled over on the shoulder. There was no logging of an excursion into the water. I told a coworker about it at lunch, one of those lean-in, you ever have your GPS freak confessions. He nodded and told me about a time a cop car's dash said he was driving in a cornfield in Nebraska while he was on a highway in Iowa. We traded stories like that, small mechanical betrayals that didn't amount to anything more than a story. He said satellites and terrain and weather could conspire to confuse receivers. He shrugged and returned to his sandwich. It's been a few weeks. The road is the same ribbon along the cliff, and the fog still comes in from the ocean like a slow river. I take the same turns. I know the houses, the spots where the road's edge crumbles, the little pullouts where kids sometimes lean to look at the water. The phone's map app hasn't misplaced me again. Maybe I had a fluke of software and weather and sheer bad timing. Maybe some satellite pinged wrong and my phone decided to play a mean joke. But every time I pass the overlook now, I slow down a little, even when Anna's not waiting up at the window. I check the mirrors more than I used to. There's a small, steady unease sometimes, a fuzz like static under conversation, and I notice more things. The silence of birds sometimes, a porch light that flicks off at just the wrong second, the way the fog sits heavier near the cliff than it does over the road. Nothing that proves anything, nothing to name. Just a feeling that sometimes in the middle of ordinary miles, the map of where you are can briefly insist you're somewhere else. That's all. It's not dramatic, it's not done to terrify you. It's just enough to make you look at the ocean at night and remember that maps are guesses, not guarantees. I was out on a night hike near the Groom Range, a few miles north of Rachel, Nevada. I'd parked at a gravel pullout off a service road around dusk and started walking in with a small pack and a headlamp. I like hiking at night in the desert. Less heat, fewer people. But that evening I'd gone farther than usual. By the time I reached the low hills at the edge of the range, it was close to 10. The moon was a thin slice, barely lighting the sagebrush, and the sky was clear enough to see a ridiculous number of stars. I'd cut off the headlamp to let my eyes adjust. The path was just an old ATV track winding between creosote bushes and low rocks. My plan was to sit on one of the hills for a while, watch the sky, then head back. Nothing out of the ordinary. About halfway up the slope, I paused to catch my breath and look around. From where I stood, I could see the faint glow of lights far off to the south, probably from the base, though you never see much of it directly. I'd been on enough of these hikes to know the difference between plane lights, helicopters, and satellites. It was quiet, except for a breeze moving through the brush. I was staring at the sky when it happened. A small, bright point appeared high up, like a star but slightly bluish. It shot downward fast, too fast for a plane or even a meteor, and I braced myself to watch it burn out. Except it didn't. It stopped. Just froze midair like someone had hit pause. I remember blinking hard, thinking maybe my eyes had tracked something weird. But the point of light was still there, hovering. Then, instead of falling, it began sliding sideways. Not streaking, just gliding smooth across the sky. It drifted toward the horizon and dropped behind the black line of the tree line, a mile or two off. The whole thing took maybe 5 seconds, long enough for me to be sure I wasn't imagining it. I stood there with my hand on my pack strap, staring at where it had disappeared. Nothing. The sky was back to normal. I kept climbing to the top of the hill, trying to convince myself it was a drone or some weird aircraft. But once I sat down up there, things started feeling off. There was no sound, not even the wind anymore. My ears rang faintly, like after a concert. I pulled out my phone to check the time. It said 10:22 p.m. I could have sworn it had been only 10:05 when I'd stopped at the base of the hill. The hike up couldn't have taken that long. I tried refreshing my GPS, but the little blue dot just spun. No service. Normally I'd get at least a flicker of reception that high up. Down below, along the trail I'd just come up, a dim light flickered between the bushes. It looked like another hiker's headlamp, but no beam, just the glow. It moved a few steps, then vanished. I waited for it to reappear. Nothing. I told myself it was just someone on a parallel path. But then my phone vibrated in my hand, a notification sound I didn't recognize. The screen flashed on for a second with a blank white box, then went black. Battery still at 60%. I packed up to head back. I didn't want to be up there anymore. The path down looked darker than before. My headlamp flickered once, then stayed on, but dimmer. The air felt heavier, like before a thunderstorm, except the sky was clear. As I reached the bottom of the hill, I caught a sound, faint, like a low humming or a power line buzz. I turned off the headlamp and stood still. The hum faded, then returned from another direction. No wind, no insects, just that sound. I started walking faster. The ATV track looked the same, but a few landmarks were out of place. Rocks I didn't remember, a dead bush on the wrong side of the trail. My gut said I was going the right way, but it felt wrong. A few minutes later, the hum stopped. Dead silence again. My watch said 10:39. My phone still said 10:22. Ahead, maybe 50 yards, a glow lifted slowly above the tree line, the same bluish light I'd seen in the sky. It hovered just above the brush, silent. Not a beam, not a flare, just a sphere of pale light, like a star had dropped to eye level. I crouched behind a rock, heart hammering. The glow moved laterally, passing across the trail ahead of me. It wasn't casting shadows the way it should have. The bushes under it stayed dark. It drifted behind a cluster of rocks and vanished. I stayed crouched for a full minute. Nothing. No sound. Finally, I forced myself up and walked quickly down the trail, keeping my eyes on the path. My headlamp flickered again, but didn't go out. After what felt like 10 minutes, I reached the service road where my car was parked. The gravel pullout looked the same, but there were fresh tire tracks next to my car. Deep, wide, not like mine. No other vehicles around. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The dashboard clock said 11:04. My phone said 10:24. Driving back toward the highway, the radio wouldn't pick up a station. Just a faint hiss. A couple miles out, the hum faded entirely, and the radio snapped back to life like normal. The phone clock jumped to match the dashboard. When I finally reached the main road near Rachel, it was 11:40. The drive back should have taken 20 minutes at most. Everything was fine at home. The GPS log on my phone had a blank spot of about 15 minutes during the hike. No photos, even though I'd tried to take one of the sky when I first sat down. Just a black square in the gallery with no metadata. I still hike during the day sometimes, but I haven't gone back out there at night. I was driving out past the last little cluster of ranch houses because I couldn't sit in the house and listen to the same fight replay in my head. It was one of those wide, empty stretches of desert road I know by heart. 2 lanes, cracked asphalt, sage and rocks, and the occasional irrigation turnoff. I took the truck because it felt safer than walking, though safer in the desert at midnight is relative. I had a thermos of coffee and an old cassette of music that still sounded okay when the radio caught it. It was hot all day, but the night came in clean and sharp, the kind of dark where the stars look like they're cut from tin. I pulled off at a turnout where the road dips and you can see the low flats spreading away toward the horizon. I like that spot because you can unspool your thoughts and there's nowhere anyone can rush you. I killed the engine and left the cab warm, the truck lights dim so as not to ruin my night vision. For a while I just sat, legs out, watching the sky and the way the desert seemed to breathe. The cicadas had died down. The only living noise was a faint, far-off hum that I later decided had been a highway, or an airplane, or nothing. About an hour into my staring, 2 pale points appeared on the horizon to the west, near where the gravel flats start. They were the color of headlights, not the sharp white of modern LEDs, but that older, slightly yellow glow. At first I assumed someone was coming along the county road, slow, maybe a truck. I'd seen plenty of pickups out there at odd hours. I watched them for a few minutes. They were together, like one vehicle with 2 lamps, both blinking with that regular cadence headlamps do. They didn't get closer the way you'd expect. Over the next 15 minutes, the points moved maybe a hair's breadth, no more than a few degrees, like a slow tide. I put the thermos down and grabbed the binoculars. Through the glass, they were still lights on a vehicle silhouette, but distance is dishonest on flat desert land. Things that seem a mile off can be 5. That's one of the tricks the place plays on your eyes. I told myself I'd head back when they got within sight, just because I didn't want to be out there if it was a drunk or someone with headlights too bright. They kept moving, the 2 points maintaining their relationship, 2 headlights side by side, no taillights that I could see. An hour went by. I dozed off for what must have been 5 minutes and woke to them in the same vague position, only a touch farther. I checked my wristwatch and my phone. Both were steady. There was no sense of time tilting, only this strange, stubborn slowness from those lights. I'd seen cars sit on the interstate due to accidents and appear stalled for long stretches, but this wasn't stalled traffic. There was no glow on the ground between us, no reflector sheen on the road. It was like 2 white pennies balanced above the flat. After a while, little things started to pile up. The dog at the corner house, the one that always barked when someone drove by late at night, slept through it. The coyotes that usually answered any lonely sound with a concert stayed silent. Even the wind, which had been picking up earlier and throwing dust against the pavement, calmed to nothing. The sagebrush held in place like it had been pinned. The sky was clear. The moon had slipped behind a bank, but the stars were bright. You expect small animals to act out of pattern in the desert. They do it all the time. But this was different. The world around me was politely pretending the lights didn't exist, and I felt like the odd one out. I tried to be practical. I turned the truck over and aimed its headlights at the far flat, then cut them so the dark reasserted itself. The distant lights didn't change. I walked up and down the turnout a couple of times, more because motion felt safer than sitting still than because I thought I could alter anything. With every step I took, the lights seemed to keep their own schedule, forward a little, then steady. I thought about driving out toward them, figuring that the angle would change and I'd realize they were half a mile away and harmless. But the last thing I wanted was to meet someone out there who needed help or was carrying something they shouldn't be. So I stayed put and watched. At about 3 in the morning, the headlights blinked differently. One of the lights dipped, then brightened. The pattern of their signals shifted a beat out of sync. It was subtle, but when your attention is the only thing in motion, the subtleties take on meaning. I had the binoculars up again, and the silhouette under the lights looked wrong. Too low, too flat, like something with a wide back and no cabin. I told myself not to invent shapes. The desert makes ghosts from every object you stare at long enough. I tried the radio, the old AM on the dash, to break myself out of the watching loop. I got static, and then, for a few seconds, a far-off voice that sounded like it was talking to someone in the way you talk to a friend at a late hour, clipped. practical. It vanished, as if the sky had swallowed the frequency. Later, I wondered if it had been a trucker calling in mileage to the dispatcher or some ham operator doing routines in the night. In the moment, the cut made my skin tighten. Hours slid by. The moon rose and threw a pale line across the flats. The lights moved like a slow animal, or like the slow breathing of something huge under a blanket. I didn't sleep more than short nods. I felt watched in that particular way where the eyes don't have to be seen to be present. My phone battery went down a notch and then sat, stubborn. I checked the map app and it behaved. It showed me where I was and nothing where the lights appeared, which is normal because the map isn't going to show a headlamp on the open flat. Eventually, 4 in the morning, maybe later, the lights did something that made me stand up and walk the edge of the turnout like a man pacing a small, polite cage. They blinked out. Not dimmed. Not shifted. One moment there were 2 small, steady points of white. The next there was nothing. The horizon returned to black. The desert exhaled as if it had been holding its breath. The relief was immediate and embarrassingly physical. My shoulders dropped by an inch. I laughed, a small, harsh sound, because laughter was easier than asking why. I drove home with the windows down, the highway lights smearing gold through the mesquite. The rest of the drive felt normal in the granular sense. Street intersections, one blinking light at the town entrance, the smell of diesel, and the bakery near the junction. When I pulled into the driveway, it was just a house with its porch light on and a neighbor's car in the driveway. Everything domestic and ordinary. I didn't tell anyone that night, because what would I say? I sat and watched 2 headlights that didn't close in for 5 hours, and then they went out. I half expected someone to say I'd been sleeping in the truck, and dreamed it. The next day, I drove back to the turnout in daylight. The flats were ordinary. Tire ruts, a dead tumbleweed, a rusted piece of fence. Nothing imprinted in the sand where lines of lights had been. The county road was quiet and a little worse for wear. The only evidence of the night was a small ring of flattened grass where I'd been sitting, and the coffee cup I'd left under the dash. Friends at work offered the usual: mirage, long-distance headlights on a service road, playing tricks. Maybe they were right. But there were too many small, stubborn things. The dogs that didn't bark, the silence of the night, the way the lights kept their distance like someone hovering at the lip of a conversation. That didn't line up with an easy explanation. I kept thinking I'd heard something on the radio, some voice swallowed by static. I kept thinking of the flat silhouette under the lamps through the binocs, which could be anything from a truck's low trailer to nothing at all. I went back out a couple of nights later as if repetition could make sense of it. The horizon was empty. Sometimes the desert gives you a loose end you can put away with sunlight and the certainty of routine. Other times it keeps a line of fuzz, a small bruise on your confidence, and you learn to let it sit. I did my best to let it sit. I sleep with the window cracked now and the truck app's locator open on my phone sometimes, more as a comfort than a tool. If there's a pattern, I never found it. The lights never returned on a regular schedule, and for my part, I don't go out sitting at that turnout on impulse. It didn't upend my life. The years keep a habit of being ordinary the rest of the time. But every so often, when I'm on that road at night and the flats are black as coal, I glance to the west and feel a small, hollowed-out sense of attention. The impression you get when you know you were watched, and the watcher decided to blink away. I was driving back from a friend's place in Alamo, Nevada, heading toward my apartment in Henderson. It was past 1 in the morning, and the road was almost empty. That stretch of Highway 93 always felt lonely at night, like you're moving through a big hollow tunnel of desert. I had the radio low, mostly for background noise, and was keeping an eye on the fuel gauge since I hadn't filled up before leaving. About half an hour south of Alamo, I noticed something odd in my rearview mirror. 3 small white lights, faint but steady, arranged in a perfect triangle. They were far back but clearly not car headlights, too high off the ground and too evenly spaced. At first I thought it was a plane, or maybe 3 planes lining up, but the formation never shifted. I watched for a few seconds, then shook it off and kept my eyes on the road. A few miles later, I glanced back again. Same 3 lights, same formation, same distance. I slowed down a little to let the car behind me, if there was one, catch up, but nothing appeared on the road. I flipped my high beams off and on, just to see if any reflection showed up. Nothing changed. The lights were still up there, small dots in the mirror. I figured maybe it was my dirty mirror or my eyes playing tricks. I wiped the inside of the windshield at the next stop sign with an old shirt I had in the passenger seat. When I looked again, the triangle was still there. The lights never blinked or moved. Past Ash Springs, the road widens and you can see for miles. I checked my side mirrors, clear. I looked straight up through the windshield, nothing but stars. I tilted my head to see more of the sky, but saw nothing unusual. Yet, in the rear view, those 3 dots stayed fixed. I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't dramatic fear, more like the slow creep you get when something doesn't add up. I kept driving and tried not to look, but curiosity made me check again every couple of minutes. Each time, the same triangle. I pulled over at a gravel turnout just before a small bridge. Killed the engine. The night was dead quiet except for a faint hum of wind. I got out of the car and looked back up the road and into the sky. No lights, just the normal scatter of stars, a few faint clouds on the horizon, and the dark outline of low hills. I stayed there for maybe 2 minutes, scanning the sky. I even walked a little away from the car to get a better angle. Nothing. I climbed back in, shut the door, and checked the mirror. The lights were gone. I started the car again and got back on the highway. After a few miles, I risked another glance. There they were again. Same formation, same distance. They didn't seem closer or farther, just hanging back like they were tied to me somehow. I tried turning off my headlights for a second. Everything went dark except my dashboard and those 3 dots in the mirror. I turned them back on quick. I even flashed my brights at nothing, like maybe it would trigger something. Nothing happened. At one point, I slowed almost to a stop in the middle of the road. There was no traffic anywhere, hoping the lights would pass or move or change. But when I came to a crawl and glanced again, they were still there, perfectly still. Around Crystal Springs, I pulled into a dirt access road used by ranchers, drove about 100 yards in and parked. I cut the engine again. This time I left the car dark and sat there, gripping the wheel, breathing slow. The desert was silent. I tilted the rearview mirror down so it pointed at my lap. Waited. After a minute, I nudged it back up. The triangle of lights was there. My stomach turned. I got out again, a little shaky. The air was cool and smelled dusty. I looked behind me. Nothing but empty desert. Looked straight up, just stars. My eyes kept flicking between where the lights should have been and the empty sky. It felt like they only existed in that mirror. I climbed back in, adjusted the mirror one more time, and watched for a solid 30 seconds without blinking. The dots held steady, no flicker. I reached back for my phone, thinking to take a photo, but the moment I raised it, the screen reflected the mirror, and I couldn't get it to focus. It just showed black. Finally, I just drove. I figured if it was some weird optical thing, it would fade. But mile after mile, the triangle stayed. I passed a rest area near Indian Springs and debated stopping, but the idea of stepping out under the empty sky again made me feel sick. Somewhere past Cactus Springs, I noticed something different. One of the 3 lights had dimmed, like a dying bulb. A minute later, it blinked out completely. Then the second went. Only 1 light remained, dead center in the mirror. I focused on the road and refused to look again for a while. When I finally did, the mirror showed only my back window and the dark highway stretching behind me. No lights. I didn't stop until I hit the outskirts of Henderson, pulled into a gas station, turned off the car, and just sat there. The sky above was blank, city lit, nothing strange. I checked the mirror a few more times while fueling up. Empty. No triangle, no single light. Just the normal reflection of pumps and asphalt. I drove the rest of the way home without seeing anything else unusual. When I parked in my spot and shut off the engine, the silence felt heavy but normal again. I stayed there a few minutes before going inside, like I needed to make sure everything around me was still ordinary. Even now, I can't make sense of it. I wasn't tired enough to be hallucinating, and I know what normal aircraft look like out here, but those lights, whatever they were, only existed in that mirror, following me for nearly an hour down an empty desert highway. I was camping alone in the sheep range north of Las Vegas. I'd gone out there to clear my head for a weekend. It's not a popular spot, mostly scrub, rock, and dry washes, but I liked the emptiness. I'd driven my old Tacoma down a rough dirt track off the main highway and pitched my tent a good mile from where I'd parked. It was late March, cold at night but warm during the day, and the sky was perfectly clear. That night had been quiet. Around midnight, I'd zipped myself into my sleeping bag, checked my phone, 12:14 a.m., and shut my eyes. I wasn't tired enough to pass out instantly, so I lay there, listening to the faint breeze moving through the creosote bushes. No sounds of trucks on the highway, no coyotes, nothing. Just stillness. I don't remember falling asleep. It felt like one of those long blinks you do when you're exhausted but still awake. 1 second, I was staring at the fabric above me. The next, my eyes opened and something felt off. At first, I thought it was my ears ringing, a low, steady hum. Not loud, more like a refrigerator or an engine idling a block away. It was just there, under everything, a sound that didn't belong in the desert. I held my breath, thinking maybe it was the wind vibrating the tent poles, but the air was dead still. The hum stayed constant, not pulsing or fading. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It said 2:27 a.m. My stomach flipped. I was sure I'd just closed my eyes a few minutes ago. No dreams, no sense of time passing, just gone, then back. I sat up and unzipped the tent partway. The air outside was cold enough to sting my face. Everything looked normal. Moonlight on the rocks, my pack where I'd left it, the faint outline of the trail leading back toward the truck. But that hum was louder now, or maybe clearer. It didn't seem to come from any direction. It was everywhere. I stepped out barefoot onto the sand. The cold grounded me for a second. I turned in a slow circle. The sky was clear, stars sharp and steady, no planes, no contrails, nothing on the horizon. I cupped my hands to my ears to block the sound, but it didn't change. The strangest part was how the desert smelled. It's usually dry and dusty, but now there was this faint metallic tang, like wet pennies. My tongue felt weirdly heavy. I went back inside the tent, zipped it up, and tried to think rationally. Maybe my phone's time had jumped ahead because it lost signal. Maybe the hum was a generator or a far-off truck. I turned my phone's screen back on. 2 full bars of LTE. Strange, since I'd had nothing earlier. The time hadn't changed. 2:31 a.m. I tried to play some music to drown out the hum. The speaker worked, but the sound felt thin, like it was being smothered. I could still hear the hum under it, steady and low. Then I noticed my compass app spinning slowly, unable to settle. I set the phone on my sleeping bag and watched the needle rotate, pause, then rotate again. I checked my watch, an old analog one my dad gave me, and the hands were on 12:18. The phone and the watch were 2 hours apart. I crawled out again, this time with my boots on. I walked a few steps from the tent. The ground felt firmer than before, like packed clay instead of loose sand. When I looked back, my tent seemed farther away than it should have been. My footprints didn't show clearly, even with the moonlight. I tried to find the hum's source. I walked toward a small rise, thinking if there was a vehicle or equipment hidden on the other side, I'd see it. But at the top, there was just more scrubland rolling out in every direction. No lights, no movement. Yet the hum was louder, like it was under my feet. I crouched down, pressed my palm to the ground. Nothing vibrated. The hum was in the air, not the earth. When I turned back, my tent looked normal again, not far at all. I walked back quickly, my heart hammering. Inside, my sleeping bag was still warm, like I'd just been in it. I lay down and closed my eyes, trying to breathe slowly. The hum went on. I counted seconds to distract myself. Somewhere around 300, I must have dozed off despite it. When I opened my eyes, the sun was just touching the ridges to the east. The hum was gone. My phone reads 6:06 a.m. My watch matched it exactly. LTE was gone, back to no service. I stepped outside. Everything looked the same as when I'd set up camp. But my boot prints from the night were gone, even though the sand was undisturbed otherwise. The air smelled normal again, dry sagebrush and dust. I packed up quickly, checking my pockets for anything out of place. My watch ticked steadily. My phone's battery was at 100%, even though I hadn't charged it since yesterday morning. I hiked back to the truck without stopping. The trail felt shorter than it had the night before. When I reached the truck, the clock on the dash matched my phone exactly. Driving back toward the highway, I kept glancing at the sky and listening for that hum. Nothing. Just the desert, empty and still. Later that afternoon, I checked my GPS log. The app had recorded a gap between 12:16 a.m. and 2:24 a.m. No data, like it had been turned off, but I know I didn't touch it. Everything I had with me was fine. Nothing missing, nothing added, just 2 hours gone, a sound I can't explain, and a campsite that felt wrong for a while. I haven't camped out there since. I was driving back from my sister's place in Beatty, Nevada, late one Sunday night. It was one of those desert roads where you can go 30 minutes without seeing another car. The sky was perfectly clear, the kind of black where the stars look like holes punched through paper. I'd done the drive dozens of times before, down 95, then cutting across a smaller county road toward Alamo, but this time I'd left later than usual. By the time I got onto that smaller road, it was a little after midnight. I had the radio on low, some classic rock station out of Vegas, and the heater barely running. My car's an old '06 Civic, not much insulation, so at night in the desert, it feels like you're driving a tin can. The headlights were catching the road signs in that washed-out green way, nothing unusual. Then something ahead of me caught my eye. At first I thought it was a plane's landing light, but it was too low and too steady. A faint glow, white with a hint of blue, moving across the sky from left to right. It looked small at first, like a star, but as I drove, it stayed with me, matching my pace without blinking. I slowed down to about 50, leaning forward over the wheel. The radio made a faint pop, like when you plug in an aux cord, and went silent. No static, just dead quiet. The heater fan kept running, but the music was gone. I reached over to adjust the dial, thinking maybe the signal dropped. Nothing. That's when the glow moved directly above me. Not fast, slow, like a balloon, but steady. It was a perfect orb, maybe the size of a car if it were closer, but I couldn't tell how high it was. It didn't throw light like a spotlight. It just glowed. No sound, no wind. I kept driving, gripping the wheel. My heart was going, but I wasn't panicking yet. I thought maybe it was some kind of drone. But it was too smooth, and there were no blinking nav lights. The orb drifted ahead of me, then slowed until it was directly over my hood, perfectly centered. Then the radio came back on, but wrong. Same station, same song, but everything was reversed. It took a second for my brain to register it. The vocals were backwards, the guitar riffs reversed. It sounded like the song was being sucked into itself. I turned the radio off completely. The silence inside the car felt heavy, like the air was thicker. The orb stayed with me for maybe another 30 seconds. My speed dropped to 40, then 30. There were no pullouts, just dirt shoulders and sagebrush. I finally eased onto the shoulder and stopped. The headlights lit up a patch of gravel and weeds. I cut the engine, but left the lights on. The orb stopped too, hanging silently above the road about 20 feet ahead. I opened the door and stepped out. The air was cold and dry. No hum, no vibration. Just that thing hanging there, glowing soft and steady. It wasn't casting shadows. The stars behind it seemed dimmer, like it was sucking up the light. I took a step toward it. It didn't move. My phone was in my pocket, so I pulled it out to take a picture, but the screen stayed black when I opened the camera. The battery indicator was at 70%, but the phone wouldn't respond. No shutter sound, no focus. I looked back at my car. The taillights were dimmer than normal. The dashboard clock wasn't lit. Everything felt muted, like when snow muffles sound, except it was bare desert. The orb started moving again, slow, drifting to the right side of the road. Then, without speeding up, it lifted, just a clean, smooth ascent. No trail, no flicker. Up and up until it was gone, blending with the stars. The second it disappeared, the car's dash lights came back on. The heater fan kicked up, the radio snapped on, playing the song normally again, right where it should have been. My phone's camera opened like nothing had happened. I got back in the car and sat there with my hands on the wheel. The dashboard clock read 12:48 a.m. My watch on my wrist said 12:27. I couldn't remember if I'd checked them earlier. I started driving again, faster this time. The radio played fine, no weirdness. My phone worked, but the headlights seemed dimmer for another couple miles before brightening back to normal. When I hit the highway junction about 40 minutes later, I stopped at the gas station there. The attendant, A guy in his 20s asked if I'd seen that light, too. I asked what he meant. He said something bright had passed over the station about an hour earlier. No sound, just light. The power had flickered inside, but not gone out. I didn't know what to say. I paid for gas and drove the rest of the way home without stopping again. Everything was normal by then. The clocks matched. The car felt fine. The next day, I checked my phone's GPS log from the drive. There was a blank stretch of about 2 minutes right where I'd pulled over, like it hadn't recorded anything. No photo in the gallery either, just a black square where I'd tried to take one. I haven't driven that road at night since. I was out jogging at dusk because I needed to clear my head. Nothing spiritual about it, just the usual loop I do when the workday has been stupid and the house is full of people. The route cuts through the older part of town where the street lamps are orange and the yards still have big trees. Then it opens up to a strip of empty field with a stand of cottonwoods on the far side. I like that section because the sounds of the neighborhood drop off and you can hear your feet and your breath and whatever stupid playlist I've got on. That evening, the sky was half gone to blue, the kind of thin, late summer dusk where the air feels heavy, but the temperature finally softens. I had my cheap wireless earbuds in and a watch that tracks pace and heart rate. I keep my phone tucked into a small armband for maps if I ever screw up the route. Everything was normal for the first mile. Footfalls, small talk in my head, the guy 2 houses down calling his dog, nothing weird. Then, right about where the pavement ends and it becomes gravel, my attention snagged on a dot in the sky. At first, I thought it was a plane, the way we all do in places that aren't completely empty, but it wasn't moving across the sky. It hung, a single white point, and it was low enough that it didn't seem to be a star, and high enough that it wasn't a streetlight. I stopped walking for a second, lifted my head, and the dot was still there. If you've ever watched how a plane's lights blink and track across the horizon, it's different. This light was steady, not blinking, just a small, steady white thing above the tree line. I kept going. Curiosity doesn't always mean alarm. I just wanted to see whether it was one of those hobby drones people fly at dusk. A mile later, the dot had moved, slightly, and it had the weird effect of appearing to be just above my shoulder in the rear view of my peripheral vision. I'd glance up and see the sky empty, and then check the slice of sky above the tree line, and the dot would be one step different from where it had been 2 seconds before. Not fast, a slow drift, almost deliberate, like someone nudging it with a fishing line. A little weird, I thought, and sped up. My earbuds hiccuped with a pop in the left bud. The song I was listening to snapped to a second earlier, like someone had fast-forwarded it and then back. The watch buzzed with a cadence it doesn't normally use, not an alert, more like a pattern, and my pace number blinked twice and then smoothed out. I told myself I was tired, that the day had been long. The house had been loud at dinner. Ignore it, I thought. Run. The field part of the route has a farm gate and an access road. There are no houses out there, like just that stand of cottonwoods and an irrigation pond that catches the light. As I passed the gate, a little cluster of lights came on in the house across the road. The family who lives there leaves the porch lamp on when they go out. That night, the porch lamp came on and then went out in a smooth, even blink as I passed. No flicker, no trip breaker sound. It was like someone switched it off from across the street with a remote. I didn't think much of it until the dog that usually barks at anyone jogging by didn't even lift its head. Usually there's a chorus, bark, rattle of a chain, the distant shuffle of feet in the yard. That night, silence. I was nearly to the trees when I noticed the light again. Only this time it didn't look like a single point. Up close, at least close enough that my brain could sense its position relative to the trees, it was more like a small disc, the size of a dinner plate if you held it out at arm's length. It was over the tree canopy, drifting slowly along the line of the woods in the same direction I was running. I checked a few things without thinking. Earbuds connected, battery at 60%, watch had a GPS lock, phone buzzer set to vibrate. All normal. The light followed at a steady, deliberate pace. When I turned my head directly upward, the air above the trees looked empty, just faint sky. But But every 3 or 4 steps, glancing to the side, I'd catch that disc shape slipping past an opening in the branches. The sensation is impossible to describe without sounding like I'm inventing it. The light didn't illuminate the leaves or the trunks underneath it like a spotlight would. Instead, it seemed to occupy a layer above them, and the area underneath stayed oddly unlit, like a shadow hanging under a glow. My brain went into that careful mode where it's trying to line up plausible explanations. Drone, helicopter far off, star seen through a thinning cloud. I had none of those. No sound. If it were a drone, it would have made a pinprick of a whine, or a bird would have gone scatter across the tree line. Nothing. The cottonwoods were still. I slowed to a walk and finally stopped, right by an old fence post that leans at a bad angle. My breath was fogging a little in the cooling air. I took out one earbud, and the other one still played a song, just enough to be company. I keep a habit of challenging weird things on the off chance there's a rational explanation. I looked directly at the light and held my stare. I didn't expect anything to happen. That's the thing. I wasn't expecting a revelation. I was expecting that when I focused on it, the brain would say, okay, it's a drone, or okay, it's aluminum reflecting a streetlight, and we'd move on. Instead, when I fixed my eyes on it, the light blinked, not slowly, not like a distant plane. It snapped off in a single instant, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. No hum, no distant dogs, no rustle of leaves. For a breath, it felt like the night had been unmade. Then the small noises of the world crawled back in. A distant car, an owl calling once, my own pulse in my ears. I stood there, foolishly waiting for it to come back. It didn't. I cursed under my breath, checked the watch. The pace tracker had stopped while I'd been standing. My earbuds showed a tiny line on the screen where the song should be playing. Then, a second later, the music resumed in my left ear like nothing had happened. My phone vibrated once in my armband, a text I hadn't felt. And when I pulled it out, the text was from a coworker asking if I'd grab the report off the printer. It was odd timing, but boringly explainable. I'd been out longer than I thought. It happens. Still, my skin had that shallow prickling where the hair lifts, an animal sort of focus. I started jogging again, a little faster than I planned. It felt ridiculous, like being a kid who looked to see if the thunder stopped and then getting soaked. But I couldn't shrug the way the light had vanished the instant I looked at it. That's the part that sat wrong, the sheer, clean snap of it, like a scene cut in a movie. 3 or 4 times on the way back, I checked the sky. Nothing. The cottonwoods were dark against a deepening blue. The neighborhood lights winked on, normal and stubbornly ordinary. I ran the last stretch past the 2 houses with the old dog and the porch light. The dog barked like it always does when I pass, the porch light swung on and stayed on, and my earbuds popped with a low-volume crackle when I took them out to untangle the cord of a neighbor's leaf blower. End of story, right? I walked back into my house, pulled off my shoes, rinsed sweat off my neck, and told my wife, because good marriages are about telling each other weird small things. She laughed in that you and your imagination way, and then she asked if I wanted coffee. I did. I made coffee, and the kitchen hummed with normal kitchen noises. The watch synced back over breakfast with numbers that matched the route I knew I'd run. The music app showed the same song, no gap. My phone had one photo I hadn't taken, a stupid accidental shot of my calf, and no evidence of anything in the sky. I didn't file a report or call anyone. Who do you tell? The local PD's non-emergency line? A hobbyist quadcopter forum? I wrote it down in my phone notes. Date, time, location, what I thought, and then I wiped the note an hour later because I was embarrassed. It felt like a private thing, a small mismatch in the heap of everyday life. The honest truth is, I felt foolish, but also sharp-edged curious. I'd been followed by a light that didn't want to be seen and then refused to exist the instant I watched it. I kept running after that because that's how I work through stuff. I left earlier a few times when the sky was still bright, just to avoid the weirdness of dusk. Once, about a week later, I took the same route after work, and the cottonwoods were full of kids, laughter, and the dog went mad, and the porch lights blinked exactly like porch lights do when a moth dives into them. The world was as it should be. I don't try to explain the light. I don't tell myself it was mechanical or spectral. and I don't tell myself I made it up. It was one of those small, unaccountable things that sits at the edge of what you consider probable. I pick my evening runs now with a little more thought. I'm home at a decent hour. I keep one earbud in instead of both. And sometimes when I make that left at the old fence post and see the trees stitched dark against the sky, I glance up, half hoping and half not. The tree line is ordinary, the stars are ordinary, which is enough. I woke up at 3:14 a.m. to a strange sound, or maybe not a sound so much as a feeling. The first thing I noticed was the vibration. My phone, which was face down on my nightstand, was trembling softly. At first I thought it was a notification, but then I realized my alarm was rattling too. The lamp chain swayed slightly, and even the edge of my dresser was humming against the wall. Nothing mechanical in the house was running. The heater wasn't on, no trucks were passing outside, no planes overhead. It felt like a low, muted shiver that had crept into every object. My bed frame buzzed faintly against the hardwood. It wasn't violent, more like the subtle vibration you feel when a train is far away, but it was everywhere at once. I sat up and held my phone. The screen was dark. No calls, no messages, no alarms. Just that soft tremor, like the world's quietest earthquake that didn't quite move the ground but set everything else quivering. I went room to room. The clock on the microwave rattled softly in its housing. My laptop on the desk vibrated enough to make a faint plastic tick. Even a half-full glass of water on the counter had little ripples dancing across the surface. But the floor under my feet was steady. The air felt heavy, like before a thunderstorm. I turned off every light to check for power lines down or some kind of electrical surge. My neighborhood was dead silent. No hum of refrigerators through the walls, no distant traffic on the highway, just stillness and that muted vibration. I stood at the window trying to see outside. It was overcast when I went to bed, but now the sky was pale in a way that didn't make sense, like the glow you get before dawn, but stretched across the entire horizon. And then I saw it. A thin, pale white light moving slowly from west to east, low on the horizon. Not a car, not a plane. It was wider than a beam, but not bright enough to be a spotlight. It looked like a strip of fog lit from within, gliding steadily. I cracked the window to listen. No sound. The vibration inside the house didn't match anything outside. In fact, outside was still. My neighbor's wind chimes were motionless, but the string inside was vibrating faintly against the tube. I grabbed my phone to film it, but when I opened the camera, the screen showed only static gray where the window should be. I wiped the lens and tried again, same result. I put on a hoodie and stepped outside onto the porch. The cold hit me first, sharper than it had been at bedtime. The pale light was clearer out here, sliding slowly across the horizon like a glacier of brightness. No distinct shape, no beam. Just a moving band of white, maybe a mile away, maybe 10. I couldn't tell. Everything was silent except for a faint pressure in my ears, like descending in an elevator. The vibration I'd felt inside was weaker out here, but still present if I held my hands against the porch railing. As I watched, the light paused. It didn't flicker, didn't dim. It just stopped moving. A few seconds passed, then it began sliding again, this time at a slight angle, almost like it was tracing the edge of the town. Behind me, something inside my house rattled hard enough to make me jump. I went back in. The kitchen cabinet doors were shivering in their hinges. My phone buzzed, but when I picked it up, the notification bar was blank. The power stayed on, but my digital clock had frozen at 3:17. I checked my watch. 3:24. I sat at the table, watching the water glass. The ripples had become smaller, slower, like whatever was making the vibration was fading. Then, from the window, a brief pulse of brighter light swept across the yard. Not like a spotlight moving, more like a flicker of daylight. I ducked instinctively, but there was no sound. Just the glow fading again to that steady pale band on the horizon. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The vibration inside the house slowed until it stopped completely. My phone's clock updated to 3:32. The microwave beeped once on its own. I stood and walked back to the window. The pale band was still there, but thinner now, dimmer, like fog dissolving. It drifted east and gradually lost its shape until it was just another patch of the night sky. I opened the door and stepped out again. The wind chimes were still. No vibration in the porch railing. The air felt lighter, normal again. I stayed out there until the horizon went dark and only the stars remained. Then I went inside. My clocks had all jumped ahead by about 20 minutes. It was even the analog one in the living room that isn't battery operated, but winds down slowly over weeks. Nothing else seemed wrong. No power outage, no news alerts, no distant sirens. By morning, everything was back to normal. I still don't know what happened, but for about half an hour that night, every object in my house trembled like it was alive, and a pale strip of light moved silently across the horizon, changing directions like it was tracing some invisible path. And when it faded, it left nothing. No sound, no damage, just a strange gap of time where all my devices were off by the same 20 minutes. I woke up because Roxy was snarling at the window. That doesn't sound like much until you hear the kind of low, sustained growl she makes when there's a raccoon on the trash or when some idiot sets off fireworks too close to bedtime. I rolled over and fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, the screen a dull blue. It was 2:06 a.m. The bedroom was pitch dark except for the tiny glow from the stove clock in the kitchen down the hall. Roxy's growl kept going, deep and single note, and she wasn't moving her body much. She was a heavy dog, mostly asleep through the night, but she was fixed on the window like something had her full attention. I pulled the curtains aside and looked out. There were figures in the field behind my house. They were the kind of feint that happens when you haven't fully focused. Thin, vertical smudges with two pale dots where a face should be, like the reflective strips on a jacket catching a distant car's headlights. At first I thought they were cows, because there's a herd that grazes on the state lot sometimes, and the moon makes eyes glow on animals. And then I realized the dots were too high, level with the shoulders on some of them, and there were too many to be cows, clustered that close to the house. I sat up. The sheets stuck to my legs. The air was warm for October, heavy with the smell of the cut hay from earlier in the week. The night was quiet in a charged way. The usual distant highway hiss had gone soft. I took a slow breath and Roxy's growl changed into a low whine that said she wanted me to do something. I slipped on jeans and a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and stepped out onto the porch. The boards sighed under my feet. When I reached the edge of the yard, I pulled the barn light switch. It popped and came to life, throwing a wash of yellow across the grass. The figures were still there, maybe 70 yards from the fence, standing in a loose line along the low rise that marks where the field drops off toward the creek. My first thought was people, teenagers with flashlights. My second was something more practical, reflective survey stakes, ghosted from the yard light. I trained the flashlight on them. The dots flashed back like eyes. They were human height, straight-backed. Some of them seemed to have something on their shoulders that picked up the light and sent it back in two precise specks. I walked the length of the porch and called out, "Hey!" My voice sounded embarrassingly loud in the night. No response. At one point, one of the figures tilted slightly, and the two specks went dim like someone had turned their head. Roxy sat on my heels, rigid. I took my phone out and tried to record. The screen focused on empty air. When I zoomed in on the spot where a figure stood, all I could see was a smear of gray and the meadow grass outlined in moonlight. Whatever reflected the porch light in a way that made them look like a face didn't show up as anything human unless I was watching with my eyes and not through glass and not on a screen. That was the first small mismatch of the night. The thing my eyes accepted didn't register to my phone. I walked down the short path to the yard gate. The field dropped away in a shallow bowl, wet in the ruts, and the morning star lights of the county line trembled far off. The figures didn't move toward me. They didn't move my direction at all. They stood like posts with pale pins of light where one'd expect eyes. I started toward the split rail fence. As I got closer, two of the figures, one's at the east end, blinked out, not in the way a flashlight dies, but like someone, very deliberately, turned their torso sideways. One instant, there were two pale dots in form. The next, the pale dots vanished, and there was only a dark vertical sliver where a person should have been. I stopped so suddenly, my boots sunk in the dew. The closest vanishings didn't look like hiding. They looked like a film removed from a frame. The space they occupied felt thinner for a second, like an exhale passing through cloth. I had the odd and small thought that maybe they'd crawled into the ditch or were lying flat in tall grass. But when I trained the torch into that patch of field, the grass there didn't stir. I shouted again. This time somebody, answered with a low sound that could have been a call or a wind through a hollow pipe. By the time I had my phone to my ear, the sound was gone. Roxy's nails clicked on the packed dirt behind me. The practical part of my brain insisted I call the sheriff. The other part wanted to stay out there and watch until my eyes burned and told me what they'd seen was real. I slid the phone into my pocket and kept walking along the fence line. The light from the house fell a little short, and when I stepped into that softer zone, every hair on my arms rose. The yard seemed to breathe a millimeter differently. I got to the point where I could see the nearest figure clear enough to tell whether it was a person or something else. It had broad shoulders, a straight stance. The reflective dots were on its chest, not its face, which made me think of tarps and backpacks. Someone must have been out there in high-vis for a reason. I called again, louder, and then the entire line of figures blinked out in the same exact way, one after another. Not in a wave, but like a string of bulbs someone had flicked. No one ran, no one dropped and rolled. It was the kind of movement you make when you're photogenic and you turn for a picture, a symmetrical change in orientation. And for the first time since I'd seen them through the window, the sound of the night moved back in. A cricket rasp, a far-off truck, tiny normal world things that had been absent earlier. I stood there breathing hard and felt ridiculous. It was close to what people do when they're trying to convince themselves rural life is the same as city life. I made my phone ring the sheriff's number, then hung it up before it connected because my thumb didn't have the nerve to press call. I walked back to the porch and locked the gate, then sat on the steps and watched the field until sweat cooled on my neck. A little while later, maybe 20 minutes, I noticed something else. The trail of dew on the grass leading out toward the trees had a patch flattened in a neat rectangle, maybe a yard across. It wasn't trampled like something had walked over. The grass lay parallel and pressed flat, like somebody had set an object down and then picked it up. It was damp and smelled faintly of metal and old hay. There were no footprints around the patch, no drag marks, nothing to suggest legs had entered or left that spot. I took a picture this time because it felt like the kind of tiny, explainable evidence that would make all of this less weird. When I checked the photo, the patch was there on the phone, but the colors were wrong, muted, as if the camera had picked up infrared more than light. The image file had a small line across it at the exact spot where the patch lay, and when I zoomed the line was a band of pixels that looked like a scratch. The scratch wasn't on my lens. I wiped it and took 3 more pictures. The patch was visible each time, but the next morning, when the sun had fully risen and the field had bleached to regular green, the grass lay normal, and the rectangle had filled itself back up. The smell had faded. I told myself no one would believe me. I told myself that might be why I hadn't called anyone in the first place. The sheriff would say kids or hunters or maybe you were dreaming, and the report would go into a drawer. But I'm the kind of person who notices the small off things and holds on to them until some explanation shows up. I couldn't find one that fit. By dawn, Roxy had curled up at my feet like she does when the world is safe again. She slept with one ear flicking because her dreams had dogs in them, and the light from the east was soft and innocent. I made coffee, tried to read the paper, and kept looking out the kitchen window at the line where the field met the tree line. The grass had no marks that morning except for the neat rectangle that had filled back in. The fence posts were where they'd always been. The county lot was a county lot, ordinary and empty. Later, when I took the garbage to the curb, a truck rolled down the county road and slowed by my mailbox. The driver leaned on the horn for one quick beep and gave a little wave. I waved back and felt the oddness like a bruise. There are some nights you will carry an image in you that other people do not have. It makes you careful in your speech, careful about how you say things that could sound like excuses for not sleeping. I don't have an answer for what I saw. I don't have a time-stamped video that proves anything. The phone photos are grainy in ways a camera's not supposed to be. The rectangle in the grass had an odd smell and left no tracks. And Roxy's growl was exactly what it should be when something is close enough to notice but not part of the world you know. I made it through the day. I did the chores, mowed the lawn, bent to pick up the kids' baseball that had rolled under the shed. The world resumed its honest smallness. I told the story to one neighbor over the fence while we replaced a broken post. He nodded and said, "All kinds of things out there at night, friend. Keep your dog close." That's what people say when they don't want to make any more of it than necessary. I promised myself I would lock the gate every night and keep a light on. I'll do the same again tonight. The field sits the same as it ever did, open, flat, indifferent. And somewhere in that plain, I know there will be room for things that look like people, and then, in a blink, aren't. It was just after midnight when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I'd been half asleep, drifting in that soft space between dreams and waking, and for a second I thought it was my alarm. But it was a call. My friend Eric. I hesitated before answering. He never called this late unless something was wrong. "Hey," I muttered, rubbing my eyes. "Dude," he said immediately. His voice had that nervous edge I'd only heard a few times before. "What the hell did you send me?" "I didn't send you anything," I said, sitting up. "That picture, the one you just texted." I blinked at the glow of my screen. My messages app showed nothing. "What are you talking about?" "The photo," he said again. "You sent me a picture like 5 minutes ago. It's..." He stopped, exhaling. "It's some kind of, I don't even know, a glowing thing, over the trees, like a craft or something. Don't tell me you didn't send it. It came from your number." "I didn't," I said flatly. There was silence for a moment. Then Eric said, "It's still on my phone. Check yours." I opened my messages. Nothing. No sent photos, no recent texts. My last message to him was 2 days ago, a meme about our fantasy league. "I'm telling you, there's nothing here." He didn't respond right away. When he spoke again, he sounded unsettled in a way that made me fully awake. "It's got your name, your number, and the picture looks like it's from your neighborhood." "You've got to be messing with me." "I'm not." "Describe what you're looking at right now," he said suddenly. "My bedroom," I said. "Dark, curtains closed." "Is your phone in your hand?" "Yes." "Check your gallery. Maybe it's there." I swiped to my photos. Nothing new. The last picture was from last weekend. Eric exhaled sharply. "I'll send it back to you. Hold on." A second later, my phone buzzed with an incoming photo. I opened it and felt my stomach tighten. It looked like the woods at the edge of my street. The silhouette of pines and bare oaks, the slope of the power lines crossing above, and hanging just above the trees was a pale, glowing shape. Not bright like a spotlight, but hazy and diffuse, like a jellyfish lit from within. It wasn't clear where the glow stopped, and the night began. I'd never seen anything like it. "Where did you get this?" I whispered. "From you," Eric said. "It literally says it's from you." "I didn't take this picture." Neither of us said anything for a while. I could hear him breathing. "Maybe your phone got hacked," he said finally, but without conviction. "Then why isn't it in my messages?" I slid off the bed and crossed to the window. The curtains were shut, but a thin bar of streetlight leaked in. I peeked out. The street was empty. The trees at the end of the block were dark and still. "I'm looking out my window right now," I said. "Nothing's there." Eric didn't answer. "Send me a screenshot of your messages," I said. A moment later, a screenshot came through. It was our text thread. My name at the top, his phone showing the picture I'd supposedly sent. The timestamp matched the moment he'd called. "I'm coming over," he said abruptly. "You don't have to." "I'm coming over." The line went dead. I stayed at the window watching the street. I couldn't see any cars. I kept looking at the photo he'd sent back. The angle was familiar, slightly uphill, like it was taken from the sidewalk near the park entrance at the end of the block. I opened my camera app and checked the metadata on the image. It said it was taken at 12:03 a.m., but had no other details. No GPS coordinates, no device info, just image.jp. At 12:20 a.m., Eric texted, "I'm outside." I slipped on a hoodie and went downstairs. When I opened the door, he was standing by his car with the engine running, his phone in his hand. He looked spooked. "You sure you didn't send this?" he asked again. "I'm sure." He turned his phone toward me. The photo still glowed faintly on his screen. This was taken at the park entrance. You can see the power lines. I know where it is. Let's go look, he said. We walked down the street together. It was colder than I expected, the kind of dry cold that creeps through fabric. Our footsteps echoed louder than usual, like the air was hollow. When we reached the park entrance, everything looked normal. The wooden sign, the gravel path, the trees black against the sky. No glow, Eric said quietly. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting something to shift. Nothing did. You still have the photo? I asked. He nodded and held his phone up. It looks like it's right there, over those trees. I looked where he was pointing. Just darkness. We stood there a long time. Eventually Eric said, maybe someone spoofed your number. Some kind of prank. Then why does the picture look like it was taken here? He didn't answer. We walked back to my house in silence. He didn't even come in, just got in his car and left. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed with the lights off. My phone lay on the nightstand. I kept checking my messages every few minutes, expecting something new to appear. Nothing did. At some point, I opened my gallery again. The same old photos, no trace of that glowing shape. But when I closed my eyes, I could still see it hanging there over the trees, faint and silent, like a lantern underwater. The next morning, Eric sent me a text. That photo's gone from my phone. I asked him what he meant. It's just gone, he wrote. The message is still there, but the image is blank, like it never loaded. I opened our thread. His screenshot from the night before was still there, but the image he'd sent back to me, the one he'd received from me, was gone. Just a gray box with a question mark. I scrolled through my photos again. Still nothing new. I don't know what happened that night. Neither does Eric. We don't talk about it much anymore. Sometimes, though, when I'm walking past the park entrance after dark, I stop and look up at the power lines and the trees. I half expect to see that pale, glowing shape again, waiting where only a camera can catch it. I'd been driving for almost 6 hours straight when I finally pulled off at one of those little highway rest stops, just a small loop of asphalt, a few dim lamps, and a single vending machine humming by the bathrooms. It was around 1 in the morning, and aside from one semi parked at the far end of the lot, I was the only one there. I shut off the engine and sat for a second, letting the silence sink in. My phone had no bars, which didn't surprise me out here. The only light came from my dash and the faint glow spilling from the restroom building. Everything else was dark. When I stepped out of the car, the air was cold enough to bite. I stretched my legs, walked toward the edge of the lot, and tilted my head back. Out here, away from the city glow, the stars looked impossibly sharp, thousands of them. I stood there, half dazed from driving, just staring up. That's when I noticed one star brighter than the rest. It was high up, almost overhead, and seemed to have a faint bluish tint. Nothing unusual about that on its own. There are plenty of bright stars, but then it blinked. Not like a twinkle, not random. 3 distinct flashes, evenly spaced. Flash, 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 then steady again. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The star stayed steady for maybe 10 seconds. Then it repeated the exact same pattern. 3 slow, deliberate flashes. I waited for a plane's red or green navigation lights, but there were none. No movement across the sky, no contrail, no sound, just those 3 blinks. I tried to tell myself it was a plane banking or maybe some satellite flare, but something about it felt off. I watched for another minute. The star was still. Then slowly it began to move. Not like a shooting star or a plane. It didn't streak or glide, it drifted. A deliberate, unhurried slide toward the western horizon. Within 30 seconds, it had noticeably shifted relative to the stars around it, like it was peeling away from the fixed background. I glanced down from my phone, thinking to record it, but the screen stayed black when I hit the button. Dead, even though it had been at 40% when I pulled in. I tried holding the power button. Nothing. When I looked back up, the star had moved farther. It was still bright, still steady, but now it was low enough that it almost lined up with the silhouette of some distant hills. Every other star in the sky looked locked in place. Only that one was gliding. A breeze stirred the trash near the vending machine, but otherwise the whole place was dead silent. The semi at the far end of the lot had its cab dark, no sign of anyone inside. I waited, watching the thing slide lower. Then it blinked 3 times again. Same rhythm. Flash, flash, flash. Then steady. I felt a pulse of unease, like a pressure at the base of my skull. I've never been prone to superstition, but something about how regular the flashes were made me feel like they were aimed at me. Not a signal I could interpret, but a signal nonetheless. I forced myself to step backward toward my car. Gravel crunched under my shoes louder than it should have. I kept my eyes on the star, half expecting it to zip closer like something out of a movie. But it just drifted, slow and patient, blinking its three-flash pattern every so often. By the time I reached the driver's side door, it had sunk so low it looked like it was brushing the horizon. I realized, weirdly, that it wasn't dimming as it dropped. Normally, stars get lost in the haze as they near the horizon. This one stayed bright, crisp, almost like a bead of metal light. I fumbled my keys, hands clumsy with cold and nerves. When I finally got the door open and slid into the seat, the interior light felt too bright, exposing. I slammed the door shut and locked it automatically. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, watching through the windshield. The star was still moving, still bright. Then, as suddenly as if someone flipped a switch, it winked out. No fade, no streak, just gone. I stayed parked for another 5 minutes, scanning the sky. Nothing, just ordinary stars. My phone finally powered back on by itself with a little buzz. Battery still at 40%. I started the engine. The radio came on, but all I got was static, which didn't clear until I was back on the highway and a couple miles away from the rest stop. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time a distant light appeared on the horizon, farmhouse, cell tower, another car, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I made it to my motel just before 3, hands still tight on the steering wheel. I double-checked the locks twice before I could even think about sleep. In the morning, I told myself it had to be a satellite or some kind of drone, maybe a trick of the atmosphere. But I've spent enough nights under the stars to know how they behave. Nothing drifts like that. Nothing blinks like that in perfect rhythm. I've driven that same route twice since. I always glance up at the sky when I stop, but I haven't seen anything like it again. Still, sometimes when I'm parked alone at night, I catch myself scanning the stars for a bright blue point waiting to move. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I first heard the sound. I'd been lying in bed scrolling on my phone, the house dark except for the glow of the screen. Everything was quiet. No cars out on the road, no wind outside, just the faint hum of my fridge downstairs and the occasional creak of the old wooden frame of the house. Then there was this tapping. It wasn't loud, more like the sound of fingernails gently clicking against glass. At first I thought it was just the tree outside brushing against the window again. We've got an old maple in the yard that leans toward the house, but the branches are still a few feet away from my second floor window, so unless there was a storm, it couldn't have been that. I turned off my phone screen and listened. The room felt suddenly bigger, darker. The tapping came again, 3 light clicks in a row. Then nothing. I sat up a little, thinking maybe it was a moth or some kind of bug throwing itself against the glass. Another 3 taps, slow, deliberate. My bed is positioned so the window's just to the left of my headboard. I didn't want to look directly at it right away. I just stared at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing, that I was just tired. But then came a different sound, softer, like the pad of a fingertip pressing against glass, dragging slightly. That's when I finally turned my head. I couldn't see anything outside, just black. Our yard is big, but we don't have a streetlight, and the closest neighbor is 100 yards away. Usually, when the moon's out, I can see the outline of the maple tree or the shed at the back. But that night, the sky was covered, no moon, no stars. It was like looking into a wall of ink. At first glance, the window looked normal. But then I noticed the condensation. It's been cold at night lately, and the inside of the glass sometimes gets a faint mist. On the left pane, right at eye level, there was a handprint. I froze. It wasn't sharp like someone had pressed their hand there a moment ago, but it was clear enough. The palm and fingers were outlined in a kind of smeared fog, with little streaks trailing off. It wasn't my hand. It was bigger, much bigger. The palm alone looked as wide as my whole face, and the fingers were long and uneven, like they'd spread too far to be normal. I sat up slowly, not wanting to make noise. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The window is old and single-paned, not the kind you can open easily, but I still reached over and made sure the latch was down. I kept staring at that handprint, waiting for it to fade or smear, but it didn't. It just sat there. I leaned closer, trying to see if maybe it was my imagination. That's when I noticed a second smudge lower down, like something had brushed against the glass from outside. Not another full handprint, just a partial arc, like a knuckle or elbow had grazed it. I backed up to the far side of the room and grabbed my phone. The screen light felt like it was drawing attention to me, but I couldn't stand being in the dark. I turned on the camera and zoomed in on the window. Through the phone, the handprint looked even bigger, the ridges of the fingers more defined. I thought about calling someone, but who? The police? What would I even say? There's a handprint on my window? By the time anyone showed up, it could be gone. Another sound came from outside. Not tapping this time, something like a faint exhale, a slow hiss of air. My window doesn't open, so it wasn't a draft. It was coming from beyond the glass. I ducked down below the sill, heart hammering. My room suddenly felt way too exposed. I could see my reflection faintly in the window, my own wide eyes peeking over the edge of the bed. But behind it, nothing. Just black. I sat there for a long time, crouched on the floor, clutching my phone. The tapping didn't come back, but once I thought I heard a faint shuffle on the gravel below my window. We don't have a walkway there, just dirt and stones. I forced myself to stand up and peek again. The condensation had started to shift with the heat of the room, and the handprint was blurring at the edges. I leaned close enough that my own breath fogged a little circle on the glass. But still, the outline of that enormous hand stayed visible. I tried to take a photo, but the flash only reflected back into my room, showing my terrified face. Without the flash, the picture came out pitch black. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes, I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and flicked it on, aiming it at the yard. The beam cut through the dark, catching the tree, the shed, the empty grass. Nothing. No one. I swept the light back and forth. Nothing moved. No footprints in the frost, no sign of anyone. Just a completely still yard. I shut the light off and went back to the window. The handprint was fading now, melting into the condensation. It looked almost like a trick of the moisture, like maybe I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew the shape had been too distinct for that. I pulled the curtains closed and sat on the edge of the bed with the flashlight in my lap. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every little creak of the house sounded like footsteps outside. When the sun finally came up, I opened the curtains again. The glass was clear. No print, no smudge, nothing. I went outside in my slippers to check the ground under the window. The dirt and gravel looked undisturbed, except for a single long streak leading toward the shed, like something had dragged a stick or a finger through the frost. That was 3 nights ago. I haven't heard any tapping since. But every time I walk past that window now, I glance at the glass, half expecting to see that huge hand pressed there again, waiting for me to notice. I was driving back from my cousin's place late on a Sunday night, cutting across a stretch of flat farmland I'd only driven once before. It's one of those places where the road feels endless. Straight blacktop, no streetlights, just 2 lanes and the occasional faded mailbox. The fields on either side were nothing but stubble and frozen dirt stretching out forever. No houses, no cars, no sign of anything but wind. It was a little after midnight. I'd been on the road for about an hour, the radio low, headlights carving a pale tunnel through the dark. The air outside was still, heavy. It felt like the whole world was asleep. At first I thought I was seeing reflections on my windshield. Off to the left, maybe half a mile out into the fields, there were lights, 3 of them, small and pale, hovering close to the ground. They weren't bright like car headlights, more like the muted glow of a porch light, but colder. They didn't move at all. I slowed down without thinking, leaning toward the glass. At first I assumed they were yard lights for a farmhouse or maybe some machinery out there. But there were no buildings, no power lines, nothing. The lights were lined up in a loose triangle, just above the frozen rows of soil. As I rolled forward, they stayed perfectly still. The weirdest thing was how steady they were. No flicker, no sway, just fixed. I kept driving, trying to tell myself it was nothing, maybe hunting gear, maybe ATV headlights. But as I passed a break in the hedgerow, I realized the triangle wasn't on any kind of equipment. It was just floating, a few feet off the ground. I slowed almost to a crawl. The road was dead empty. Nobody behind me, nobody ahead. I rolled down my window to listen. Nothing. Not even the wind. By then, I was maybe a quarter mile from where the lights were. They still hadn't moved. My heart was hammering. I thought about stopping completely, but something in my gut said keep going. I put my foot back on the gas. That's when the lights started to lift. Not all at once, slowly, like balloons slipping upward. No sound, no dust or debris kicked up from the ground, just rising. They went from a few feet off the soil to maybe 30 feet up, still in the same loose triangle. I stared, trying to make out any shape between them. If it was a helicopter, a drone, anything. There'd be rotors, a fuselage, red or green nav lights. But there was nothing but dark between them. They hung there for a second. Then, all at once, they moved straight up into the sky. No acceleration like a plane or helicopter, just a smooth, silent climb. Within a few seconds, they were so high they looked like faint stars. Then they were gone. The road ahead felt endless. My hands were slick on the steering wheel. I kept glancing out the window, hoping to see some logical explanation. A tower, a windmill, something. But there was only open field. A minute later, I realized my radio had gone to static. I hadn't noticed when it happened. I reached over and spun the dial, but every station was nothing but hiss. Even the low hum of my engine felt different, muted somehow. I drove another mile like that before the static broke, and the radio snapped back to the station I'd been on, mid-song. It was like someone had just flipped a switch. I told myself it was probably just bad reception. This was farm country, after all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the air inside the car was heavier than before, like a pressure change before a storm. I passed another hedgerow and caught movement in the corner of my eye, just a flicker of pale light out in the field again. I snapped my head to look, but there was nothing there, just rows of dirt and frost. For the next 20 miles, I kept expecting to see headlights in my rearview mirror, some truck or tractor or anything. But the road stayed empty. I finally hit a small gas station at an intersection and pulled over, more to steady my nerves than because I needed anything. Inside, the guy at the counter gave me a look like I'd just seen a ghost. He asked if I was okay. I said, yeah, just tired, and grabbed a coffee. When I came back out, the fields around the station were dark and still. No lights, no sound but the buzzing of the neon sign. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the horizon. Nothing. I drove the rest of the way home with the radio off. Every few minutes I checked the sky, but it was empty, just a low ceiling of clouds. I don't know what I saw. Maybe there's some kind of agricultural equipment I don't know about, maybe drones. But I've replayed it in my head 100 times now, and nothing fits. No engine noise, no blinking beacons, no gradual movement, just 3 silent lights lifting off the ground and sliding into the sky until they disappeared. I got home around 2. My hands were still trembling when I turned off the car. The house was dark and quiet. I didn't tell anyone about it that night. I just locked the doors, shut the curtains, and lay awake for hours, waiting for my heartbeat to slow. It's been a week since then. I've driven that road again during the day. The spot where I saw the lights is just an empty field, flat, frozen, nothing there but bare soil and stubble. No tracks, no equipment, no structures. Every night since, I've caught myself glancing at the sky before I go inside. I don't know what I'm expecting to see, but part of me almost wants to see it again, just to prove it happened. Another part hopes I never do. I like walking the woods near my place in the evenings, and last fall I decided to set up a few trail cameras. Nothing unusual about that. I'd been curious what moved through at night when I wasn't around. Deer, foxes, raccoons, maybe the occasional coyote. I bought 3 mid-range cams online, strapped them to trees in a triangle about a half-mile off the trail, and let them run. For the first couple of weeks, it was exactly what you'd expect. Grainy infrared footage of deer nosing the underbrush, raccoons waddling around, the occasional owl swooping down in blur. I liked flipping through the SD cards with a cup of coffee in the morning. It felt like a private glimpse into another schedule of life. Things happening when the woods belong to everything except people. One night in late October, though, something was off. I'd pulled the card from the camera I had set facing a low clearing, maybe 20 yards wide. This was the spot I was most curious about. Something about the way the trees opened up, like a bowl. A lot of animals seemed to cut across it. I loaded the files on my laptop and clicked through. Most clips were 10-second bursts triggered by motion. A deer sniffing around, a rabbit freezing at nothing, a fox cutting across with its tail high. Then I got to one clip that looked strange. At first I didn't notice it. It was just a still-looking clearing, the infrared tint making everything silver and flat. But when I went frame by frame, there was one image in the middle of the clip that caught me. In that single frame, every tree, dozens of them, looked bent slightly to the left, not broken or fallen, just leaning, like a wind had hit them all at once. But the next frame, literally 1 second later, they were upright again, totally normal, no swaying, no visible shift, nothing. I thought maybe it was compression or a glitch. Trail cams aren't high-end equipment, but I scrolled back and forth. The trees really were leaning. The trunks themselves looked warped, like the whole frame had been tugged sideways and then let go, and the undergrowth was bent too. The ferns, the tall grass, all of it tilted, then back. I stared at that single frame for a long time. The oddest part was that the animal in the shot, a young deer, was mid-step in both frames. In the leaning frame, its legs were bent the same way as the trees, like the whole animal had been pulled too. Then in the next frame, it was walking again, like nothing had happened. I didn't know what to do with that. Over the next few days, I went back to check the other cameras. Different angles, different times, but on 2 other cams there were single frames just like it. Everything bent the same direction for a split second, then normal. No sound, no debris, nothing else to suggest wind. And the angles weren't consistent. The trees leaned north in one, west in another, south in another. Always the same effect, a momentary pull, like gravity had been shifted sideways. When I went back out to the woods after seeing that, I felt weirdly self-conscious, like I was stepping into a place that hadn't agreed to share what I'd caught. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. That sounds cliche, but there's usually at least some sound, wind, birds, a branch creaking. That day, it felt muffled. The trees were still, but not the way they usually are on calm days. More like they were holding still. I swapped cards, adjusted straps, and left quickly. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. My dog was pacing by the back door, whining low. I let him out, figuring he needed to go. He stepped onto the porch, froze, and growled into the dark. I couldn't see what he was looking at. The woods start about 30 yards from the back of my yard, and all I could make out were the shapes of the trees. They looked different. The lines weren't vertical. It was faint, like an optical illusion. But some of the trunks seemed to angle in ways they shouldn't, converging like drawn lines. I rubbed my eyes, looked again, and they seemed normal. My dog wouldn't stop growling, though, until I finally dragged him back in. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked the cameras again. One had recorded nothing, another had captured a possum nosing around. The third, the clearing cam, had a clip that made me stop cold. There was no animal to trigger it, just the clearing, still and empty. Then, in the middle of the 10-second clip, the same thing happened again. Everything leaning, this time sharper. The trees almost bowing. And when it snapped back, the timestamp skipped. Instead of 3:41:12, it went straight to 0:41:15. 3 seconds gone, like the camera had hiccuped. I sat there staring at the laptop screen, listening to the hum of the fridge in the kitchen, thinking about my dog growling at 3 a.m. After that, I started bringing the cameras in at night. I couldn't make myself leave them out anymore. They're still in a box in the garage. The woods looked normal when I walked them during the day. Ordinary trees, ordinary undergrowth, birds chattering like nothing is wrong. But I don't go out there at night anymore. Every so often when I look out the back door at dusk, I catch myself watching for that lean, just waiting for the moment when the whole tree line might bow again, even if only for a second. And sometimes if I stare long enough, I think I see it. A faint pull, like the world out there is tilting some way I can't follow. I took the red eye because it was the cheapest option and because I figured I'd sleep on the plane better than I did in any hotel room. I work odd hours enough that red eye is a thing I can say without drama. This one left at 1:15 a.m., gate 5, and I remember the late walk through the terminal where everything was half lit and the cleaners were stacking chairs and the coffee shops had a tired, polite energy. I was trying to catch up on email on my phone when they called final boarding, seat 23A, window, and I shoved my bag in the overhead and settled in. The cabin was that narrow, sleep-conditioned place airlines arrange for overnight. Dimmed lights, people with blankets, a few laptops glowing like small private altars. The flight attendants moved with the practiced silence of people who do the same thing at the same hour every day. We taxied out, engines thumped steady, the city lights rolled away, and then I watched the wing cut away into black. There's a comfort in the drone of engines that makes thinking slow. I told myself I'd try to nap. For the first hour, everything was ordinary. The seatbelt sign went off, a few people nodded off. The beverage cart made its quiet click as it passed. The pilot's voice came over the PA around 20 minutes after we reached cruise. Routine, calm, a little clipped. We're cruising at 34,000 feet. We expect smooth ride. Expected arrival 2:20 on the dot. The usual small talk. There were a few odd little things before the thing I remember. The lavatory light over the aft galley blinked once and stayed dark for a beat, like it had hiccuped, then came back. A woman 2 rows up asked for a blanket in a whisper, and the attendant answered with a question I couldn't make out on the first hearing, and then repeated, "Right here," like she'd woken from something. A faint smell of burnt coffee moved through the aisle and then dissipated. Tiny, ordinary misfires you notice more because you're awake than because they mean anything. I woke properly sometime during the second hour because I'd been staring out the window at a cream scatter of clouds, and the sky had that hard in-between blue that happens before dawn. My eyes were half closed, the headphones still over one ear, when I thought I saw a light, low and off to the left. At first I assumed it was another plane, one of those far-off white specks that hover in the same band of sky, but it didn't blink like a nav light. It stayed steady, and it wasn't moving the way other aircraft did relative to my window. I shifted and angled my head. The light was just off the wingtip, maybe a mile or 2 away. Hard to say at altitude because depth is weird up there, but it looked close. Closer than it should. Not just close, but keeping pace with us. Whatever it was in our lane of sky and matching the speed of our engine hum. I nudged the woman in the aisle seat. "You see that?" I asked, stupidly casual because the first thing you do in an airplane is gaslight yourself. She blinked at me, rubbed her eyes, and peered out. She shook her head. "Nope," she said, and then went back to sleep. The man across the row grunted and turned over. No one else seemed to be looking. The light stayed where it was. After a few seconds, I could make out not just the steady glow, but an impression of form. A long, dark smudge between me and the point of light, and that point, steadfast, not blinking, sitting where a plane's nose light might be if a plane had no wings and no strobe. I tried to remind myself of how headlights can look at night, how phantom reflections can sit on a window. I tried to think of wake turbulence and other explanations. My rational checks stacked up, but none of them clicked comfortably. I pulled my phone out and aimed it at the window. The camera app came up like always, the crosshair in the middle, settings idle. I tapped to focus on the light, and the image on the screen did something that the window did not. It smeared the point into a thin vertical streak, like a long exposure would. I snapped a photo anyway. The file that saved was a dark smear with a white smear down the center. Not a picture that solved anything. I turned back to watch, and the thing had moved a fraction closer, almost like it wanted to keep an exact offset to our wingtip. It kept pace with us for the better part of 10 minutes. 10 minutes of watching is a long time when nothing else is remarkable. I found myself counting engine pulses against the blink of my screen, because time doing nothing gives you room to notice other small things. The cabin temperature gauge reading on the back of the flight attendant's uniform, the way the light in the overhead panel over the exit row dimmed and brightened once without any announcement, The pilot's voice, a single clipped check-in with ATC that sounded normal until I replayed it in my head and realized it had ended mid-syllable. At one point, the flight attendant who had passed by earlier came back with the cart, and I pointed out the window and asked quietly, "Do you see that light?" She braked the cart. Her face went concentrated, like someone scanning a distant shore. She tilted her head, and for a second I thought she was going to go check with the cockpit. Instead, she smiled, a sort of professional, placating smile, and said, "Looks like a distant traffic aircraft, sir. We'll let the pilots handle it." Her tone said, "Don't worry," which is what cabin crew are trained to say. It didn't answer the question. Phones around me buzzed sporadically, secondhand alarm vibrations, a chime for a missed call. The seatback screens glowed with their tiny safe menus. In a small, cumulative way, the cabin felt like a little island of business as usual around something that was not. I watched the light move in careful translations, a little left, a little right, always keeping that same offset. I thought to check a flight tracking app out of some vague, nerdy curiosity. I pulled it up under the blanket so it wouldn't bother my neighbor and typed in our flight number. The map showed our route, the little icon marking our position, and a blank real estate where any other traffic would normally be listed. Those apps showed dozens of tiny blips sometimes on a route. That stretch of sky on the screen was politely empty. That was the small, private bit of unease that thudded in my chest. Instruments and apps that usually agree with what you see were not agreeing. I tried to shoot a short video with the phone. The camera kept pausing when I pressed record, as if the shutter had a hiccup. When the tiny clip finally saved, I played it back, and the light in question flickered across the frames like a smear, then seemed to hesitate and then resolve into a small, near-circular glow for a single frame before the video ended. It was not a satisfying piece of evidence, only a glitchy little file that refused to show the steady, patient way I'd watched the object keep pace with us. After a while, the pilot's voice came on again. It was a little breathier than before, and he said, "Folks, we're going to start a gentle descent in just a few minutes. The weather at our destination is settling in." No mention of another aircraft, no reassurance about traffic. The lack of mention made my attention prick at the edges. If there had been an actual aircraft this close, would the report be routine, heavy, or somewhere in between? I didn't know, and that not knowing is the kind of thing that multiplies in an enclosed cabin. The stranger moments kept coming in small ways. My watch, a cheap digital thing that had matched my phone earlier, blinked its time 2 minutes ahead and then corrected itself. The woman across the aisle who'd asked for a blanket earlier folded hers into a neat parcel and arranged it on her lap the exact same way, twice, as if she'd rehearsed the motion. A child in row 28 woke up crying and then stopped mid-cry, like someone had put a hand gently over a mouth. These are petty things, the sort of details you might not even remember from a regular flight, but on that night they formed a pattern like small stitches trying to hold a scene. Eventually, later in the flight, but still before the descent, the thing that had been pacing us simply eased off. It didn't accelerate away, or climb, or spiral. It moved sideways a degree or two, the tiny glow dimmed, and then it receded into the bands of distant lights where other aircraft and ground lights blur together. It wasn't dramatic. No alarm, no sudden turbulence, no announcement. Just a quiet, mundane fade back into the already complicated night. When we crossed the coastline and the pilot announced our final approach, I watched the sky like someone peering through a keyhole. All the instruments and apps and crew and passengers were back to their usual common pieces. When the wheels hit the runway, the landing felt normal. No excessive force, no skid, just the polite thump and the rolling of tires. The cabin burst into the small noises of people collecting bags and checking seats. Someone joked quietly about coffee and the plane moving like a sleeping person. I laughed the laugh you do when you need to be civil. Later, in baggage claim under fluorescents that make everything human-sized and explainable again, I thought about telling the ground agent, or the pilot if I crossed him exiting the jet bridge. I'd half expected a corroboration, a bored nod and an account about, we had some traffic that paralleled us for a bit. But when I asked the attendant at the gate, he shrugged and said, "We didn't get any traffic alerts. If it was there, it was brief. His voice was flat and practiced. A pilot coming out with a cup gave me a polite look, one of the kind that said safety first, speculation later, and moved along. I did what most sensible people do. I folded up the memory into a small private file. One weird stretch of hours where my eyes and the instruments and other people didn't quite line up. I saved the glitchy photos to a folder and didn't post them. I told my partner about it over coffee the next morning in the way people tell odd little stories, half laughed, half uneasy, and she said, "Maybe it was another plane on instruments. Maybe your camera just freaked out." That's probably right. We both agreed and moved on to other things. But I remember how long it held its position, how close it had felt when I kept counting engine pulses against its steady point of light, and the way the flight attendant's smile had been the kind you give when you don't want a stranger to be more scared than they already are. I remember the ineffable, patient quality of it, how it didn't seem in any hurry, and how it left the way it had arrived, quietly, without fuss. I was home by noon. I went to work the next day, and then the next. And life kept folding itself into appointments and groceries and meetings. I didn't call the airline. The flight tracking app never added a dot that matched what I'd seen. No one I asked directly had noticed anything. It's the kind of thing you tuck into a corner of your memory like an object you don't dust. It didn't threaten me, and it didn't announce anything, which is perhaps the most unsettling part. It existed in the middle of ordinary travel and then, apparently, did not. I set my phone up on the picnic table because the sky over the ridge was ridiculous that night. No moon, a smear of stars so thick it made the air taste cold. I wasn't trying to be clever. I'd driven up to the little rental cabin outside Bishop for a night away from people and thought I'd do what I always tell myself I'll do when I get alone. Actually look up instead of half watching while scrolling. I propped the phone against a beer can, opened the camera app to time-lapse, and hit record. The screen went dark and tiny points of light started to jitter in the preview like a live constellation. I wasn't an astrophotographer. My gear was a year-old phone and a warm jacket. Still, I liked that the phone could catch movement, clouds rolling, the faint trail of satellites, while my eyes softened everything into settling black velvet. I needed to be outside anyway. The cabin's thin walls let in the toaster's hum and the faint TV glow from the neighbor's place. Out at the picnic table, the night felt less like something that had happened to me and more like something I could sit with. The first odd thing was a small mechanical hiss from somewhere in the cabin. I went to check and found the old mini-split heating units, the display blinking like it was trying to talk. It had been temperamental all weekend, cutting in and out. That wasn't the kind of strange that frightens you, just the kind that puts you on edge if you're already alone. I tightened the scarf I draped over the post and went back to the table. Crickets were thin that night. I missed that sound more than I expected. On the trail down from the road, there were usually a dozen singing at once, a constant background you could let settle into your head. That night, the field beyond the cabin was eerily clean sounding, like someone had muffled the world with a blanket. I told myself I'd noticed different animal rhythms before. Wind and temperature change bugs' habits. It's practical to have reasons. I kept watching the little live preview as if the phone would pronounce the answer. Later, when a truck drove past on the distant service road, the headlights flashed over the pine trunks, and the scope of silence broke. The truck's sound seemed to stop a few yards away and then reappear after a beat. It was subtle enough that if I hadn't been paying attention, I'd have missed it. But something in my chest tightened. The feeling that whatever made that interruption had been watching the truck pass came with a mild nausea. I stepped around to the side of the table and checked the line of trees. No one was there. I made coffee and sat there for a while, turning the cup between my hands. The phone kept recording. The time-lapse frame rate was low, nothing fancy, one frame every few seconds, but that would be enough to show star motion and the occasional meteor. I told myself I would check it in the morning, that this was the kind of thing people look at with a cup of coffee and then shrug off, but I liked having a record. Not to prove anything, just to prove I'd taken the time. I fell asleep with my coat over my knees and woke at some point to the sky thinning at the horizon, a silver that suggested dawn but wasn't dawn. My watch said I'd slept maybe an hour. I checked the phone, which was on the table where I'd left it. The screen was dark. The camera app displayed a single frozen thumbnail in the corner like a bookmark. The battery icon hadn't changed much, which I took as a good sign. The place had sketchy power, and I didn't want to wake the heater. I went back to the cabin for a while, put on the kettle, cleaned up the mugs. Around 2 in the morning, I grabbed my jacket and went back out because the cold was sharper and I couldn't ignore that quiet feeling in the skin. The phone was still recording, low and regular. I sat, thumbed the screen to wake it, and watched the stars march in the tiny preview. They looked like stretched paint. Everything else felt ordinary enough then. Breathing, the distant caw of a night bird, my flashlight beam cutting a neat arc when I walked down to the water 100 yards from the cabin. I scanned the shoreline. Nothing odd, only the black mirror of the lake. The second odd thing happened when I walked back. I'd left the cabin's porch light off. It was a cheap light that tended to leak a little. As I approached, I saw the porch glow up for a second like someone had clicked a switch, then die. No step sounds, no shadow in the doorway. I climbed the 3 steps, and the paint on the rail was cold. I told myself the motion sensor had a hair trigger. It hadn't been the first time. I turned the porch light on, and then off, the bright white making the world sharp for a moment and then settling. I let the phone record the rest of the night. Part of me wanted to see a meteor streak. Another part wanted to catch nothing at all so the recording could be just a quiet document of a quiet night. I fell asleep in the cabin properly after that, which felt like a small victory. In the morning, I booted the phone and loaded the video files. My first few shots were exactly what I expected. Star trails, a faint streak from a satellite, an airplane's linear crawl that washed out between frames. Then I reached the sequence from around 3 o'clock and slowed the playback. There was a bright pin of light in the usual star field, one of the brighter stars near the ridge. And in the footage, that pin did something my eyes had not seen. Instead of trundling in a smooth arc with the rest of them, the light paused, then traced a tiny triangle, moved to a square, drew a neat little pentagon, and then slid back into its place in the lines like nothing had happened. The movements were tidy and geometric, the star stepping between corners and edges with a precision that made my chest tighten. I sat there and watched it frame by frame until the coffee had cooled. Each little shape was exact, each transition neat. The star didn't flicker, it moved. When the little pentagon completed itself, the rest of the stars were still, the time-lapse showing the world in small, regular increments. I rewound and watched the tiny dance again and again, each time feeling like someone had moved some small piece of the night just out of reach of my own perception. My first rational thought was a software glitch. The phone could be overlaying frames wrong, the time-lapse could be corrupted, the image sensor could be weird. I copied the file to my laptop and opened it there. Same thing, the star made geometric patterns. I checked metadata, frame rate, exposure settings, everything looked normal. The coordinates embedded in the file matched where I'd recorded. No edits, no weird layering. It was all very technical and very stubborn. Later, half hoping for a different explanation, I walked out to the porch and scanned the sky with my naked eyes. The star in question was there, steady and bright like any other point. No movement at all. I cupped my hands and peered, squinted, lay on my back on the picnic table bench. The night was ordinary from where I was standing. A soft cold, a breeze in the pines, and an aircraft vapor trail to the east. I felt ridiculous and protective of that ridiculousness. If that star had moved for me, I thought, I would have felt it. But my eyes swore it was still. I emailed the file to a friend who runs a small amateur astronomy group. He answered earlier than I expected. His message full of cautious curiosity. Could be lens flare, could be internal image stabilization, could be a sat reflected weirdly. He suggested I try the file on a different player. I did. Same result. He asked for the raw file. I sent it. He wrote back that night saying he'd look in the morning. The cabin's weird little things didn't stop stacking up. When I took the trash down after checking the footage, the neighbor's dog, the one that had slept all night, followed me from a distance and then sat a dozen yards away, watching me with a disproportionate intensity. It didn't run or whine, just watched. The hairs along my arms prickled in a familiar way that has nothing to do with temperature. I pitched the bag in the bin, closed the lid, and then saw the dog blink and trot back to its porch like it had been given an order. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe the geometry was an artifact. Maybe my tired brain wanted a pattern. Maybe the dog's behavior was unconnected. Explanations were at hand, plausible and decided. I clung to them at first because it's easier to sleep with stories that fit into a sensible weave. That afternoon, I met the astronomy group at the little diner off the highway. They were helpful and technical in precisely the way that is comforting, talking about pixel mapping, lens aberration, atmospheric seeing. One of them, Janice, who'd been doing time-lapse work in that area for years, listened to me and then said gently, "If it's a real motion, a star can't do that in the sky unless your frame of reference is wrong." She suggested I try recording again that evening at a different frame rate, mount the phone on a stable tripod, and use a manual exposure instead of the phone's auto mode. I did everything Janice recommended. I set up properly, used a coffee can as a shim once more because the screw mount on my phone holder was stripped, and I went to bed early. I was careful not to nap outside this time. The night was colder and the crickets had returned, a steady tick that felt normal. When I loaded the second night's footage the next morning, I held my breath. There was the usual motion of the sky, a couple of satellites, one brief meteor, and nothing else unusual. No geometric star dances. I felt both relieved and oddly disappointed. If the first night's thing was a fluke, that was a fine and tidy thing. The universe was handsome and mostly predictable. But the footage from the first night didn't behave tidily. I watched that small star draw its perfect pentagon again and again. Janice called after she'd looked at the raw file and said, "I don't see processing artifacts. I can't explain it with gear." Her voice was practical, like someone measuring rainfall, but I could hear the part of her that was curious. I kept going back to the cabin for a few more weekends, recording in different ways in different places, trying to chase the shape of that night into something I could name. Each trip I brought different gear, tried different apps, varied exposure. Sometimes the recordings were utterly ordinary. Sometimes there were tiny anomalies, a stutter in a single frame, a dot that seemed to slide a fraction of a degree between shots. But never that neat mechanical ballet. People told me reasonable things. "Your phone is cheap," a cousin said over the phone. "Phone's artifact. They're basically toys for this." An old teacher texted, "Perception is limited. Look up longer." Those answers existed and were true in the ways they could be. I needed them because I wanted my day job and my life unchanged. But the footage kept its geometry. It didn't care if I wanted it mundane or meaningful. After the fifth weekend, I stopped sleeping out at the cabin. The place had a different feel when I left. Small noises that used to sound friendly now set my jaw. I put the raw file in a folder I labeled Sky Capture Raw and backed it up. I unplugged my night lapse app and used my evenings to read novels I hadn't managed to finish. I went home, unpacked, and made coffee in the light of my kitchen with the radio on low to blot out the hush. I could have deleted the file. People collect odd things to make themselves feel like witnesses to the world's scene. I didn't want it to be a talisman. I also didn't want it to be a lie. So I kept it. I keep it in two places now, one copy on the backup drive and one on a small thumb drive in a desk drawer under a stack of neutral papers. When a friend with a rational bent asks about the weekend, I tell the story plainly. I recorded stars, one of them moved in a way I didn't see, and I couldn't find a reason that fit every piece of evidence. That's all the part I can comfortably live with. I made it home every night, and I kept my job, and I talked with neighbors. The world stayed ordinary most of the time. Sometimes, when the sky is clear and I'm washing dishes with the window open, I think about how a camera can show you emotion your eyes don't catch, and how that changes you. Not by making you believe something dramatic, but by putting a small notch of uncertainty into a place you used to take for granted. I don't know what else to do with the footage. I don't have a theory I like. I don't have an answer I can swear by. So I lock the drawer, make the coffee, and go on. The file sits there in the dark, neat and geometric. And when the house is quiet and the night is clear, I imagine the star drawing its little shapes again, careful as a pen on ruled paper. I went outside for a smoke because the argument was still simmering in the kitchen, and I wasn't ready to try and make sense of it. It was late, just past midnight, and the whole neighborhood had gone quiet in that way suburban nights do, where even the streetlights seem to hold their breath. I like smoking on the back steps. There's a small patch of sky between the maple and the neighbor's eaves that feels private, like a slice of the world I can stand under and not be part of anyone's plans. It was warm for October, humid enough that my shirt stuck to my back when I took the carton from my pocket. The night smelled like rain that hadn't come yet, and a drunk moth banged itself against the porch light for a while until something else drew it away. I lit up, took the first long drag that I never let myself enjoy in the house, and watched the ash hold and fall slow. The first odd thing was small. The neighbor's porch light across the alley turned off. Not a bulb burnout, not a flicker, the way my wife snaps a light switch off. I watched it because it was in the corner of my eye, and small irregularities catch me. 2 seconds before it went dark, the dog across the yard, the one with the mean bark that starts at 6 a.m. on the dot, had been pacing at the window and then went rigid, ears pricked. The dog whined once and then stopped as if he had been told to quiet. The porch light died and the dog pretended not to notice. I told myself it was nothing. People do odd things. Dogs get bored, circuitry fails. I took another drag and scanned the stretch of sky beyond the maple. The stars were sharp, the thin cloud line near the western horizon faintly lit by the city. Something moved near the tree line, and I thought it was a plane at first. The steady blink of navigation lights you get used to seeing. But when I shifted to get a better look, the little red and white blinks didn't glide. They lingered. Not hovering like a helicopter. Helicopters make a sound that travels through bones. This was different. Static. Star, like suddenly deciding to flash. Faster. I squinted, more because I had nothing else to do than because squinting is a habit. And then the thing tilted slightly, and the pattern of the lights matched the outline of a small airliner. It had the 3 points of red and white that line up on a wing and a tail, the steady, slow blink of landing lights, except the craft didn't move forward. It just sat over the houses, engine soundless, in the same place, lights blinking on their usual cadence. That was the second odd thing. There was no sound. The late-night street hum, a distant HVAC compressor, the whisper from the highway, was there, normal, but nothing like the low thump or whine you'd expect from something that size. If it had been a helicopter, I would have heard rotors. If it had been a plane on instruments, there should have been a distant motor thrum. I went through airplane mental checklists in my head and kept coming up empty. I stood up on the step because the porch is higher and I wanted the line of sight unobstructed. From that angle, it looked for all the world like a small passenger jet caught in the sky and paused. The blinking lights were in that familiar pattern heads-up pilots use to show orientation. The blinking was steady and perfectly timed, red, white, white, like they always are. But again, the object wasn't making any progress. If anything, it seemed to be sliding a hair sideways with each blink, very slowly, as if someone were nudging it with a stick. I told myself it was perspective. I've watched planes hold in a holding pattern and seem to hang when they're 30 miles away. I know how your brain tricks you at night. I tried to rationalize again, breathed out, and when I pulled the smoke from my mouth, it tasted like ash and something metallic faint at the back of my throat. Maybe that was nerves, or the heat, or the leftover taste from the night's dinner. Maybe the plane was simply so far off it appeared still. That explanation would have been fine if a moment later the radio in my kitchen hadn't snapped to static and then cut out entirely. That's the third small thing. The radio went from the old country station, that melancholy two-stepper station I like, to that flat white noise you get when a broadcast fails. It popped once and went dead. For a second, I thought the rigged old receiver had finally given up. Then I realized the house wasn't different. The oven clock still glowed its green digits. The fridge hummed. The radio was the only thing that went flat. A neighbor passed on the sidewalk, Mrs. Carter in her robe with a flashlight in her hand, and she paused on the path, peered up, and blinked twice the way people do when they're trying to make faces line up to memory. She asked, low and practical, "Do you hear that?" I said, "Hear what?" And she didn't answer me. She just kept watching the sky. At that point, I got mildly annoyed at being the only one not in some committee to watch the sky. My brain wanted a group explanation, some communal shrug. But no, she didn't explain her pause. She shuffled on and went inside. The dog that had been silent earlier started the tiniest whimper, like a note someone holds, maybe because they think it should mean something. I took another drag, because standing there with nothing in my hands makes me fidget. The plane lights bobbed their slow blink, and then one of the white lights, the forward navigation lamp, went out. That should have been a blink, routine. Instead, the red on the left stayed and the right white died. And for a heartbeat, there was not even a strobe where that light should have been. Then it popped back, and the pattern continued. Small mechanical things fail, sure, but they don't fail in a rhythm that keeps the outline of an aircraft clear. At some point, and I'm not sure when because my sense of minutes fuzzes when I'm nervous, the maple leaves above me stopped rustling. There was the faintest suggestion of a breeze on my calves, but otherwise the night's sound, cars, distant TV laughter, a late dog walker, receded like a hall of mirrors. The house's HVAC clicked and then didn't come back on. My watch, a cheap thing that vibrates when I have calls, buzzed twice, though the phone was in my jacket and I wasn't getting calls. The vibration came from me, I realized. My pulse trembled so that the wristband read it. The tech thought it was a notification. I went and grabbed my phone. I thought the camera might be a comfort. If I could get it on video, the thing would be just a plane and someone would say, "See, missed approach, holding." And that would be that. I set the phone up on the railing and started shooting video. The screen showed what I saw, 3 blinking lights, stationary. I zoomed and the pixels returned the same pattern. The exposure hovered. The phone kept the lights from overexposing the dark sky. I panned a bit and the lights seemed to drift, then held. After about a minute, which felt like 5, the light pattern shifted slightly and then began to move. Not forward, but upward, a smooth, tiny climb that left the rooflines undisturbed. I expected the sound to come, any motor at all, but the night remained a hush that felt deliberate. The lights faded into the upper black, and then, as if a string had been cut, the blinking stopped, and the sky regained its usual dotting of distant stars. I sat on the step with my phone still recording, the little red dot in the bottom corner pulsing quietly. The video showed the lights and then black. The file saved fine. Later, when I watched it on the bigger screen, you could see how steady the object had been. You could see the momentary dropout and the rise. Plenty of pixels, no distortion that screamed cheat, cheat. It didn't solve anything. Video can lie by omission just as well as by commission. My wife came out then, hair in a messy knot, and asked if I'd been outside long. I said I was fine, put out the cigarette by jamming it into an old tin. And the two of us stood together and stared up for a minute that felt close to sacred, because everything was ordinary again. The dog barking sweetly at the moon, a car passing with a radio song you could almost make out if it moved slow enough. She rubbed my arm, a little rough, like she was anchoring both of us. We went back in because the kitchen light beckoned, and there were plates to wash and words to pick up in a more reasonable tone. In the morning, there were the usual post-midnight explanations. Maybe it was a medevac that held for the airport approach path. Maybe it was a private plane circling for fuel. Maybe I'd been out too late, too tired. The video I took didn't help much because people, when shown a short clip with 3 lights that don't move, do what people do. They offer plausible mechanics. It's perspective, a coworker said when I showed it in a bleary exchange over coffee. You see it from one angle, and it looks like it's not moving, but it's miles out. Someone else, half joking, said maybe the airport had a training night. I like those answers better than the emptier ones I could come up with. If it was perspective, if it was a holding pattern, and the sound had somehow been beam steered away from my house, that's fine. Maybe there's some mechanical explanation involving wind shear and the way sound carries with humidity. It doesn't change how small and isolated I felt when the dog was silent, when the radio flatlined, when the porch light died and came back like a blink. My wife hugged me on the porch and said, "You should quit those things," tapping the cigarette in my hand. I shrugged and put the rest away. The tiny human rituals made everything else feel less like an enormous question and more like a night with one odd, unsolved moment. We washed the plates, argued mildly about nothing important, and went to bed on opposite sides of the mattress. The sky looked boring through the curtains, familiar. I still think about it. Sometimes as I pass under that slice of sky on my way to work, I look up and scan for slow blinking lights, and I catch myself quickening pace when a plane crosses. It's dumb and practical. The world kept turning, the airport kept running, trains kept their schedules. No one went missing. The object I saw didn't follow me home. It didn't announce anything. It hung there for a while as if taking a breath, and then it kept flying or it didn't. Either way, it left me with something small and refuse-like in my memory. The kind of thing you pick at while waiting for your toast. Maybe it was just a plane. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, I closed the door and turned off the lights and tried to sleep. I was crossing the Fourth Road Bridge just after midnight because the A90 was quiet, and I wanted to be in Fife before the pubs let out. The rain had eased into a fine drizzle that made the road look like a ribbon of oil under the streetlights. My name's Duncan, and I drive for a living, so bridges are ordinary things. Long, practical spans that get you from A to B. But that night, the bridge felt like a corridor between two different rooms. The first odd thing was that there were almost no cars. I hadn't expected traffic at that hour, but I had expected the occasional lorry or a taxi, something to break the concrete rhythm. The lanes were empty enough that I eased into the middle lane and kept the cruise on, more so I could look around without fussing with my foot. The bridge's span lights hummed along, but the usual background roar you get from a steady stream of tires was missing. Even the wind seemed polite, just a steady shove against the side of the van, rather than the usual gusts that try to wrestle you on higher decks. The radio had been playing some dull late-night show. I like voices on the air when I'm tired. And then it softened into a thin, high static that came and went like someone breathing on the antenna. I twisted the knob and it cleared for a second. A snippet of speech about roadworks somewhere near Dundee, and then back to that thin hiss. Phones showed patchy signal earlier in the day. I blamed the carrier at first and didn't worry. Then the little satellite icon on my sat-nav blinked and froze for a heartbeat, recalculated, and offered me my position 100 meters off where I was. My wristwatch, a cheap analog thing I never trust, but like, for the look of it, had skipped a minute when I glanced down to check the time. Small things, not enough to make a man stop, but enough to slow his breath. I kept the wipers at a steady pace and told myself the bridge had a different mood at night. The sea below was a black strip with the Kincardine lights like a shallow constellation on the horizon. There were no ferries crossing, no other vessels that I could see, just the usual distant glow of the coastline. About halfway across, I noticed something moving level with the van, outside my passenger window. At first, I thought it was a reflection. Bridge lights, the smear of my own headlight, but it didn't line up with anything. It was an orb, pale and soft, hovering like it had been hung on an invisible thread. It kept pace with me, exactly the same speed as the van, floating maybe 5 meters out from the railing and at roughly the same height as the top of the cab. It didn't bob in the wind. It didn't flicker. It had a very steady glow, like someone holding a hand lamp behind a sheet of vellum. The second odd thing came in the way I noticed the car behind me wasn't there. There was no sound in the lane beside me, no headlight tail, no scanner whisper of other traffic. I blinked and looked to the rear view. The motorway stretched empty into the dark. The orb drifted along, steady as a metronome. I'd seen drones before, lads with cameras testing them over the river, but this wasn't a drone. It had no blinking LEDs, no visible rotors, no staccato noise. It made no sound at all. My hands tightened on the wheel, that small, cautious grip drivers use when something unexpected is in their periphery. I slowed a touch to see if it would move relative to the van, thinking probably stupidly that I could outpace it for a look. It matched me exactly, closing and opening with the van's pace like someone had set it to shadow mode. I flicked the dipped beam to fog and back just to get the light to play over the glass and see if there was any physical hull to it. Nothing changed. The orb was a pale, even disk of light, indifferent to the best of my automotive fiddling. I wanted to film it, the modern reflex, but I didn't want to fumble with my phone at that speed on the bridge. I tried to steady my breathing instead, the old trick I used on long hauls when my eyes wanted to close. The hum of the bridge lights grew a little louder in my ears, or maybe that was the blood in my temples. In the passenger seat, my thermos rattled when I braked for a slowing lane, a small domestic sound that undercut the strangeness like someone had put a kettle on in the middle of a church service. There was a scent then, faint and metallic, nothing like petrol. The sort of smell you get when you're in a workshop with old batteries left on a shelf, a copper tang that made the back of my throat feel raw. It wasn't strong enough to make me cough, just present, like someone had opened a window to another room and a scrap of that room had drifted across. I checked the vents, half expecting the van's heater to be doing something, but the fan read steady. The radio tried to speak over the static and then cut clean to silence. When I glanced down at the dash, the digital clock was where it always is. I can be crap with time when I'm tired, but I noticed because the heater clicks and the sat-nav chimes have a rhythm I'm used to. The clock read out 17. I looked up, watching the orb slide with me, and then the instant the glow went out, the clock jumped to 20. There was no fade in the light. One moment the orb was there, soft and steady, and the next it was gone. Gone with no acceleration, no noise, no streak of departure, just a small rectangle of ordinary sky where a pale circle had been. The bridge didn't sound different, but my ears were ringing with the possibility of what might have been. The dashboard's jump happened the same time. My watch hadn't moved, but the van's internal clock had leapt forward 3 minutes like someone had nudged it. My sat-nav recalculated and placed me in the same lane, no suggestion of any gap. I didn't brake. You don't on a bridge if you can avoid it. I kept going because stopping there felt like asking for trouble. My hands were damp on the wheel. The van's engine reading stayed steady. The wipers cut the drizzle in a rhythm I could trust. There were no cars behind. There were no other lights alongside. The traffic cameras later showed an empty road divided only by my own white van as it crossed, time-stamped 020, the same as the dash. After the bridge, the road opened into the town and the ordinary world stitched back together. A petrol forecourt with its buzzing canopy light, a bus shelter with a guy asleep, a cat that darted across the curb like it had somewhere very important to be. I pulled into my driveway like I always do and sat for a few minutes with the engine warming and the keys cold in my hand. The kettle at home would be on until the whistle. The bedroom light left on like an invitation. I felt the small absurd urge to check every clock in the house, as if I could force time back into agreement. Inside, everything had its usual rhythms. The hall clock ticked quietly. The microwave gave its usual beep when I reheated a ready meal, and the TV was set to a channel I knew for late-night highlights. My partner, Roisin, was awake and smiled when I walked in like I always do, tired and relieved. I wanted to tell her what I'd seen in those precise, small sentences that make things digestible, but the words felt clunky, like someone asking you to describe a feeling by naming colors. "Traffic quiet," I said instead, and she nodded, then asked if I'd had anything to eat. I made tea and watched the steam draw lazy circles up the kitchen window. The van's clock, taking a 3-minute leap, sat stubborn and small in my head. I checked my phone. The photo I'd thought to take was just a blurred smear where the orb had been. A smear that the phone's software had tried to interpret and failed. The file's metadata showed it was snapped at 0017, but the phone's system time matched the dash, 20. Little disagreements like that gnawed at me. Over the next day, I told a couple of people at work, and they smiled and said things you say to each other when you want the conversation to move on. Tired eyes, odd light, fog on the estuary. I found myself watching the bridge on the evening news as if it were going to offer a replay. Nothing turned up. The footage I pulled from the dash cam when I got the van in for its routine the next week showed a white van, drizzle on the lens, and then a patch where the light had been that the video skipped over like bad editing. The timestamp on the camera file matched the dash. The bridge cameras, the council told me when I called as a matter of curiosity, had shown nothing untoward. I don't have a picture that proves anything beyond a small smear on a phone and a skip on a dash cam. I don't have a noise that you could pin down and say that's what happened. What I have is the memory of an orb that kept pace with my van as if it had been driving with me, the impression of a clean cutout in the sky when it vanished, and a dashboard clock that refused to agree with itself for 3 minutes. People go through their days with small anomalies, and the world stitches them in 100 unbothered ways. I made tea, I checked the locks, I did my laundry. A week later, I drove back across the Forth and felt the same bridge under the tires and the same drizzle on the paint. Only this time when I glanced to the side, there was nothing at all. Just empty air and the distant blink of the oil rigs being themselves. The clock on the dashboard behaved like a model citizen. I parked in the same drive and walked into the same kitchen where Roizen made a joke about me being late. Some nights I still wake up and think I can hear a soft, steady glow where nothing is, like the feeling the bridge left of being somewhere you shouldn't have been. The sensible part of my brain tells me it was fatigue, or reflections on wet glass, or an electronics hiccup that made clocks lie. The other part, the part that keeps a list of small, impossible things, remembers the 3 minutes and the way the light matched my speed and then stopped existing the second I blinked. I don't know what to do with it. So I make tea and fold the clean shirts and call it a night. I was on the roof because the roof is the only place in my block that still has darkness enough to see anything beyond the sodium street lamps. I'd set the telescope up between the rusting HVAC units and a dying potted palm, tripod feet on the gravel, red headlamp tucked into my jacket so I wouldn't wreck my night vision. My name's Marco Reyes. I'm not an astronomer, just someone who likes to point expensive glass at empty bits of sky and try to make sense of the small things moving up there. The night was the kind of cold that sharpens edges. Late October, clear, with a thin crescent moon. I was logging the Cassiopeia sweep when my planet tracking app pinged a satellite pass. I always check satellites. They move like they're on rails. This didn't. At first I saw 4 points of light, evenly spaced, crawling across the sky as if someone had snapped a line of LEDs into place. They held formation perfectly. No drift, no jitter. Just that quiet, mechanical glide. Then they did something that made me sit back from the eyepiece because it made no sense in any of the little rhythms I knew. The formation split, not a diffusion or a scattering like a flock of birds, but a clean break. The 4 points arranged into a square, then 2 points slotted inward to make a diamond. And suddenly one of the points folded inward on an angle so sharp it looked like the light had just stopped being a dot and was now an edge. The motion was instantaneous, like a page flipping. I blinked and the thing had changed again, corners forming and reforming, more geometry than flight. I checked the scope for reflection, tapped the eyepiece, thought maybe an internal glitch. The live feed on my phone showed the same thing, just smaller, so it wasn't me hallucinating. I started recording because that's what you do when something refuses to behave. You make a copy, so later you can argue with it. The lights moved with that odd, clean choreography for maybe 3 minutes. They'd push in, snap apart, slide sideways without the faintest arc, vanish for a blink, and reappear a fraction of a degree away. No sound at all. The air on the roof was ordinary. Traffic down the avenue, a dog barking once, a far plane. But the motion itself had the wrong physics. Sharp turns that would tear apart any aerodynamic surface, pauses that weren't pauses but jumps. After 10 minutes, I felt stupid and small and intensely awake all at once. The sky settled back into its normal scatter. An airplane crossed with its blinking nav lights, a satellite that actually behaved like a satellite. I packed the scope away with my hands, still a little clumsy. I thumbed the recording and saw the file, the little thumbnail moving, but when I tried to open it, my phone choked. File corrupted, the media app said. which is the polite way electronics tell you you don't own the moment you thought you owned. I shrugged and went inside because it was late and because there's always the argument that rooftops have the best ghosts. The next morning, I had to get up for work at the public library downtown. I've been the evening reference librarian there for 3 years. The job is mostly lending answers and shushing teenagers. Library work is sensible, which is why what happened after the roof felt strange on top of strange. I walked out of the staff entrance at 8:15 and 2 men were on the sidewalk across the street. I noticed them because the morning felt ordinary, and then the men were there. 2 dark silhouettes in suits unlike anything you see on a Tuesday outside a library. Black wool, narrow ties, shoes so clean they looked new. They were standing under the awning of a closed storefront, both staring in the exact direction of the library entrance. They weren't talking, they weren't shifting weight, they were just watching. There was something about them that made my stomach drop slow and precise. The way they held still like a camera prevents motion blur. The sameness of their posture, the way they avoided buying coffee or even pretending to check their phones. It was the way movie extras look when the director hasn't called rap. I told myself I was being childish. Maybe they were waiting for a friend. Maybe they were private security. People wait on sidewalks all the time. I changed my route to the front door because the staff entrance was closer. But as I passed the window of the bakery across the street, I caught them out of the corner of my eye. Still there, still watching. Inside, I couldn't focus. Someone asked me where the genealogy microfilm was, and I pointed and then had to go back and look at the copy of the roof video I'd finally managed to force into existence on my backup drive. The file opened this time, but there was a single frame where the lights folded inward that was pure white, like someone had erased that instant. I scrubbed back and forth, and the white frame stayed the size of a single heartbeat. At 11, I told my supervisor I wasn't feeling well. He raised an eyebrow. People call in for colds all the time, but I could see him thinking it over and deciding the day would pass without me. When I walked back out to the staff entrance, the 2 men were closer now, under the plane trees by the newsstand, still staring at the library door. They hadn't budged. They didn't follow me. They didn't approach. They merely stood and watched in that slow, spectator silence until I rounded the corner and started home with my chest a little tight and the afternoon wide open. The whole way back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting them to be driving behind me the way men in suits in bad movies do. The street was empty except for a delivery van. The world had its usual noise. Trains, a kid on a bicycle, someone on a lawnmower. I should have called someone. Police, a friend, a manager, but the rational options reeked a little of overreaction. Excuse me, there are 2 men staring at my workplace doesn't sit comfortably in the phone. Instead, I sat on my couch and tried to make sense of the white frame. I tried to find the moment again on my site clipboard, dug the backup card out of the glove box, but a day later, the file behaved differently. The recording would play up to the white frame and then, as if bored, jump forward a second and resume. Not corrupted, altered in a way that looked like someone had edited the world's continuity. Over the next 48 hours, other little things piled up around that first weirdness. My apartment clock lost 7 minutes and then caught back up. My neighbor told me her baby monitor recorded a burst of static at 2 a.m. No voice, no melody, just a thin sweep like the breath of old radio tubes. My phone battery drained faster than it had any right to. The weather app on my tablet showed rain for the afternoon the next week, and then, when I checked again, a different forecast. Small, plausible glitches, each one wearing the shape of coincidence. On Wednesday, I went back to work. I said I'd been clear-headed all morning, and meant it at first until I rounded the newsstand and the men were there again. A little further down, still in their suits and still watching the door like they were cataloging the comings and goings. A mother with a stroller paused and looked at them and then hurried away differently, like her sense of a normal morning had shifted. A bus driver swapped a look with a shopkeeper and then shrugged it off. The men kept watching. When I left early again at lunchtime, they watched me a while longer. From the sidewalk, their faces were as blank as copies. No sunglasses to hide eyes, nothing to anchor them to the rest of the city. I kept my head down and walked. The whole time I had the odd sensation that they knew which pocket held the telescope key, that they had the white frame of my video memorized like a schedule. I thought about parking across town for the evening, about sleeping at a friend's, about changing my clothes and vanishing for a night, but I didn't do any of those things. I walked home because habit is a tie. That night I tried to be ordinary. I cooked pasta, I did the dishes, I pretended the sky was the same sky. The topaz of the streetlight through the blinds looked the same as it ever did. I left a red headlamp in the drawer by the door, just in case. When I closed my eyes, the white frame was a bright, jagged thing behind my eyelids. I don't know what those lights were on the roof. I don't know who the men were on the sidewalk. I don't know whether the missing frame is a hole someone cut in time, or a bad app, or a trick of electronics colluding with my nerves. All I know is that the city felt a little watched for a while, like when you notice a new camera and can't unsee it. I also know I left work early 2 days running and that two men in suits stood across the street both times and did nothing but look until I was gone. I was driving home late one night just outside Ashtabula when the fog started rolling in. Thick, low-hanging stuff that swallowed up the road and everything else around me. I hadn't planned on it getting that bad. 1 minute I was cruising along the usual stretch of Route 20 near Lake Erie, and the next, the world turned gray and dense, like someone had dumped a blanket over the whole town. My name's Dave Hollis, by the way, born and raised in this part of Ohio. I worked nights at a gas station in town, so this wasn't my first foggy drive. But this night was different. I was about 5 miles past Geneva, heading west toward home in Ashtabula, when I saw headlights coming at me through the mist. Pretty normal, right? Except the car never came close. It was like the headlights were floating in the fog, getting closer but never actually passing me. No engine sound, no tire noise on the wet road, just those two steady beams cutting through the gray. I slowed down, watching the lights. They stayed directly in front of me, maybe 100 yards away, moving like they wanted to meet me. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, hoping to give the other driver room to pass, but the lights just stopped, hanging there in the fog. I sat for a minute, staring into that murky nothing. The night was silent, except for the faint hum of my engine idling. Then, out of nowhere, something else showed up ahead. A soft glow, blue-white and kind of hazy, appeared about 50 yards down the road in the fog. It wasn't like any car light or street lamp I'd ever seen. It was just there, floating maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the fog kept swallowing it up. Then suddenly, that glow shot straight up, like someone flipped a switch. It shot up into the sky in a smooth, fast line and disappeared into the clouds above. I swear, right after it lifted, everything went dead quiet. The usual distant sounds, crickets, cars on the highway, even the hum of my own truck, all just stopped. It was like the whole world paused for a second. I sat frozen for a long moment. Then I shut the truck off, rolled down the window, and listened. Nothing. Not a bird, not a breeze, not even the usual crackle of insects in the weeds. When I finally turned the truck back on, the headlights were gone, the fog had thinned a little, and the normal sounds of the night came creeping back. I kept driving, eyes darting to every shadow and movement in the woods beside the road. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched or like something had slipped right past me in that fog. At home, I double-checked the locks and sat for a while just staring out the window at the dark road. I still don't know what that light was or what it was doing out there, but I know I wasn't imagining the silence that followed. And if you ever find yourself driving through thick fog near Ashtabula late at night, watch those headlights closely. They might be what you think. The ground under my sleeping pad started to hum before anything else did. I woke because the vibration was insistent enough to move my elbow in the tent. It wasn't the soft, regular weight of a passing truck on the distant forest road. This was thin and steady, like a bass note pressed into earth. I lay there for a second, thinking it was a rainstorm or my imagination, then unzipped the flap and peered out. The treetops were leaning the same way. Not a breeze, not a gust, not that random rustle you get when a squirrel runs along a branch. Every crown on the ridge across the creek angled in the same direction and held. The leaves didn't shimmer. They held that tilt like someone had tilted the whole forest to one side. My headlamp beam skimmed the pine needles, and they didn't move except to reflect the light back. Above them, a long, pale glow was sliding across the sky. It wasn't a dot or a flash. It was a soft, stretched light, maybe the shape of a canoe if a canoe were blown up and lit from inside. It moved slow in one clean glide without edges, more a suggestion of something than a form. Silent. No rumble, no wing wash, nothing. The reflection of it made the creek look like it was breathing white under the dark. The ground under my pad vibrated in time with that light, a faint pulse through the soil that sounded like a far-off train if you put your ear to the rail. My name's Nate. I'd hiked up into the Laurel Hollow area for 2 nights by myself. No signal, no one at the parking lot, the sort of trip you take to get a clean head. I'd set the tent on a small bench near a tributary because it was flat and I liked the sound of the water. I knew the route. Creek, switchback, the ridge, then down to where the old logging road flattened. I'd locked the car, walked in at dusk, saw 1 or 2 other headlamps far off on a different spur. Nothing out of the ordinary until a dozen small things that are easy to ignore stacked in a row and made a pattern. Before I set up, there had been the deer. I cut across a meadow and 5 of them froze in the brush like cutouts. Not running, not startled, just statues with their heads turned the same direction. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds while my heart did that slow thud thing, and then one blinked and they melted into the trees, and that was that. I chalked it up to the way deer are. Then there was the headlamp I passed on the way in. I heard the rustle at the shelter ridge, and the beam swung once and died like someone had dropped their batteries. I called out and got nothing back. Later that night, I walked by the same spot and the lamp was gone. No footprint, no drop pack, nothing. When I reached camp, I found my small compass lying in the tent vestibule with the needle dancing like a drunk. Not a slow wobble, full spins 10 degrees back, then another snap. I'd had that compass since college. It wasn't fragile. I blamed it on the magnet in the stove lid, but the stove was in the bag and the bag had been zipped when I left. It calmed eventually, but I remembered it because it felt like the world was making small exceptions to its own rules. The stream that night was louder than I expected, but sound was doing weird things everywhere. Some of the owls were quiet, and the frogs stopped altogether at 11 when I looked at my watch. I assumed a cold front had moved in. The clouds had been thick earlier, broken now into a dark river of sky, low like someone had folded the heavens. The weather app on my phone didn't load. I didn't expect it to, but the barometer on my little handheld read steady, which made the sudden silence all the more notable. The glow kept sliding. It moved just outside the tree line, following the ridge. It didn't blink, it didn't sharpen, just flowed like a slow tide. The breath in my chest kept catching because everything else that normally says, "This is fine," the leaves, the insects, the damn creek, had become an audience frozen in a theater. I unzipped the tent all the way and crawled out in my socks. The dirt underfoot was cool, and when I crouched down, I could feel the vibration clearer. It wasn't like a single thump. It was a steady, double-tap pulse that ran along the root lines and made the grass hum. My phone screen stayed black when I tapped it. No camera, no map, nothing. No bars, which is normal up there, but it felt wrong to be so cut off with something like that overhead. I made a stupid decision. I grabbed the little binoculars from the pack. Up close, the glow didn't show structure. You couldn't tell if it was something big far away or something thin and close. The edges were soft, and it moved as if it were being pulled on a string with a gardener's patience. When I held the lenses steady, my breath fogged the glass, and for a second, a smear of my own breathing covered half the view, and I saw nothing but the smear, and then the glow was gone, swallowed by the night. The treetops dropped back, and the undergrowth started making their normal sounds, a cautious return like fingers unclenching. That loss, both the suddenness of the vanishing and the way my watch seemed to read a time that didn't match what I remembered, was what stayed with me most. I checked the watch because I always do. It read 1:04 a.m. I blinked and thought, no, I'd sat up earlier at midnight for a second, had looked at it, and it said 12:46. When I checked again, my watch slid calmly to 1:05, as if nothing odd had happened. Time felt elastic in that moment, like a rubber band pulled then let go. I didn't start hiking out until first light, partly because I wanted daylight to make me braver, and partly because I thought maybe I dreamt it. The route down felt normal at first. The creek, the rooty switchbacks, the blazes on the oaks, but the forest kept giving me small signs that something had been there. My trail marker tape, bright orange, was gone from a spot I'd tied one to for later sighting, and in its place the bark had a narrow scratch like a fingernail across a ledger. I found another marker a quarter mile on, lodged in the crotch of a sapling, folded around like someone had retied it and left. No footprints, no trash, just those odd, precise little rearrangements. I met one other person coming up as I was heading out, an older woman with a day pack and a dog. She waved and said good morning like we do in places where people know each other's faces. "You camping?" she asked. I'll tell you how I answered. I shrugged and said yeah. Just a quick overnight. She didn't press. Later, she told a story to whoever would listen about lights she'd seen years ago and how animals react, and I thought about stopping her to ask if she'd noticed anything the night before, but I didn't. There's a way people tell certain things. They look at you with the expectation you'll nod, and then they move on. Maybe she'd seen this once and filed it under anomalies. The descent back to the car took longer than it should have. Somewhere on the old logging bridge, I had to stop because both my knees felt like they'd been pinged by a bolt of cold. The air tasted different, like it had been filtered, and my chest kept fluttering in a way that made me check my pulse a stupid number of times. The radio in the parking lot, the one on my friend's truck that I used to check the weather, was static when I flicked it on. I sat for a few minutes just watching for other cars. By the time I drove out of the forest and onto the paved county road, it was nearly noon. The sun had burned off the low cloud in bands, and the sky looked ordinary. I remember glancing at the tree line from the car window, and the pines looked smaller somehow, as if the night had inflated them, then deflated them. I texted my sister when I hit a signal island up on the highway, told her I was coming home a day early. Her reply was what you expect. Good, bring coffee. I almost called her and said, don't go into the Laurel Hollow if you can avoid it. But I didn't. How do you put the words together without sounding like a half-formed thing? Driving home, the funny aftermath set in. A kind of alert curiosity that kept me aware of every passing shadow and streetlight. At a gas station, I checked the footage on a dash cam, and there was nothing but my truck, the timestamp, and then a short blank white frame that appeared at the exact period when the glow had passed. The clerk shrugged when I asked, said his camera sometimes hiccuped. He didn't spend the kind of money to look for the hiccup. I didn't push. That night, in my apartment, I lay awake until 2 a.m., lights off, listening for the hum that had once run under me. There was nothing but the building's machinery. The elevator, a pipe clanging occasionally when someone above took a shower. The planets were clear in the window. I thought about going back the next weekend with someone, a friend who knows how to handle the dark, but the idea of the routine of a second trip felt wrong, as if by replaying it I'd break something sealed. I told two friends about it in the week after, one that I go hiking with a lot and one who's obsessed with weather anomalies. They both had soft ways of deflecting. Maybe it was lenticular clouds. Maybe you were really tired. The weather friend said the treetops could look like that with certain microbursts, and the watch could be a glitch. I didn't say the binoculars showed nothing when the glass fogged. I didn't say the vibration was like a note under the ground. I left out how the river looked when that light's reflection passed, like something had smoothed its skin and then gone. Weeks pass, and you tuck things away. You unpack the moment, fold it into your usual narrative like a stray receipt in a wallet. But the habit stuck. I look up at the sky more than I used to. Sometimes at the edge of night, I will stand on my balcony and watch cloud banks crawl and wait, stupidly, as if I've trained my eye to a cue. Most of the time, there's nothing but light pollution and the drone of traffic. I went back to Laurel Hollow last month during the day, walked the ridge, checked the trees. The orange marker tapes I'd hung were where I'd left them. The old logging bridge had a new plank. Someone had been there. The scratch on the bark is still there, thin and pale, like a scar on a hand. I run my thumb over it and it feels ordinary. Just healed wood. No one I spoke with had at that moment seen anything odd. They'd heard the usual stories about lights over the county, not one specific recollection, just a sense that the place carriers old events. So that's it. I went up for a night, something odd crawled the sky, and the forest behaved like an audience that forgot how to breathe. I came home. I sleep in a bed that doesn't hum under it. I make coffee in the morning and drive to work and pay attention to small things that used to drift by me. I don't have a tidy explanation. I don't have footage anyone reliable would accept. I have the memory of treetops leaning together and a pale, long light sliding silent across clouds while the ground under my tent pulsed like a bass note. That memory lives with the rest of the things you try to shrug off but find yourself checking for anyway, the way something that shouldn't happen did, and how everything resumed as if some rule had been paused and then resumed, leaving a space in your day where it had been. I was cruising at 2,500 feet, hand on the throttle, when something that shouldn't have been there slid up beside the left wing. My name's Mark Delaney. I fly a Cessna 172 for myself. Instruction work, odd ferry jobs, the kind of flying that keeps you honest about weather and stick and rudder. That morning, I'd taken off from the grass strip outside of town just after sunrise. It was a clear day, visibility excellent, little high cloud coming in over the range. I had the window cracked, the engine sounded like it always did, and the headset was doing its lazy job of keeping ATC and the world at a sensible distance. Before the thing showed up, there were small, stupid wrongs that I filed away and blamed on being human. About 10 minutes out, the GPS box hiccuped. The little moving map icon froze for a beat, and then jumped a quarter mile to the right, like it had misfiled my position. I glanced down, tapped the unit, and it went back to normal. My heading indicator gave a faint wobble, nothing a quick scan wouldn't sort, and the compass needle did that tiny nothing you would call it wobble pilots notice and say aloud, "Huh," and then look away. I told myself it was electrical noise, an odd bit of interference from a tower or a microwave dish somewhere breakfasting on the horizon. There were other moments that stacked up. A distant high-altitude airliner banked over the far ridge, and the radio static we usually accept as part of the morning chorus swelled for a second and then thinned out. A flock of blackbirds leaked across below us and made a neat silver pattern in the sunlight before scattering. The engine note, I swear to myself I noticed it for a half second lose the tiniest edge, like someone rolled off a piano key. All fixable, all things you talk yourself down from as you reach for a cup of cold coffee at Cloverleaf Fields. It was the kind of morning that lets you stay calm because everything you do has a check on it. Instruments, scan, repeat. Then the shape came up beside us. At first I thought it was another Cessna. Formation flying's common enough in this patchwork of training fields. I glanced in the left mirror, then out the side window. There was a silhouette keeping pace with us at our 12 o'clock, slightly above, maybe 200 feet off the left wing. The oddest thing was the angle. It wasn't oriented like a plane. It sat at a tilt, one edge pointing down into the valley, the other tipped up toward the cloud deck, as if someone had rotated it on an invisible hinge. It maintained that impossible attitude and didn't seem to care about the concept of lift. There were no nav lights, no strobes, nothing to give away the presence of wings or a tail. The surface looked matte, pale against the sky, just enough contrast to cut the sun's sheen into a soft outline. It made no sound, not the faint whine of turbine, not the wind rush you expect when something passes within earshot. For the fraction of a second, I thought of a glider or a banner tow or some experimental ultralight. Then I thought of the practicalities. No pilot would try to hold that angle in an updraft. No FAA-sanctioned glider flies without tow lines in controlled airspace. I did what you're trained to do. I called it in. Traffic at 2 o'clock, same altitude, unknown type, I said into the mic, voice steady enough. Requesting traffic advisory. My hands didn't tremble. You don't want to be the pilot who lets the airplane feel your nerves. The tower was the little approach desk over at the regional field, chipper voice, slow coffee tones. Say again, Mark? Traffic at 2 o'clock? They asked. I described what I could see. The position, the odd angle, the lack of strobes. I expected them to reply with the usual unable or no traffic observed, but I figured they'd at least say they saw something on primary radar. They didn't. We have no targets on the scope in that quadrant, Mark, the controller said. Squawk for us, ident. I hit the transponder to 1200 and toggled ident. The little squawk light blinked dutifully, and the ATC voice came back a little flat. No secondary return. I'm not showing anything on primary or secondary in your vicinity. Altitudes, heading. I told them my altitude, heading, position, relative to landmarks. They read back nothing. The audio on the frequency ran normal. A Cessna inbound from the south asking for taxi, a maintenance truck requesting fuel, the world being the world. But the space beside me had that pale, silent presence that stayed level with my left wing. I kept glancing at it. It moved in sync with my plane, not with turbulence or wind. When I made a gentle 3-degree left turn to get a better view, it matched me, holding that slant exactly, never banking cleanly into the turn like a winged aircraft must. I thought about rolling the plane onto its back for a look, the kind of impulse that's almost stupid enough to be brave. Instead, I tightened my scan, kept an eye on instruments, watched the sky. The controller on the ground advised I climb to 3,000 to keep traffic separation. I acknowledged and slowly added power. The shape climbed with me, staying at our left at that impossible, easeful angle, still silent enough that the only sounds in the headset were the pumps and the paper squeak of the ATC's log being turned. I repeated my sighting, told them it was maintaining position. The controller repeated back that her radar showed nothing. Mark, are you VFR clear? You're looking at a big bank of cloud to the west. You might be seeing a reflection or a sundog, she said, reasonable as a librarian. I considered sundog. Sundogs are explainable, nice, known. This wasn't a halo effect. This had shape and deliberate motion. I tried to use the hood of my glare shield to cast a shadow and see surface detail, anything. The outline stayed pastel. My brain started making catalogs of aircraft I know. No wings, no empennage, no prop wash. It had sides that suggested structure, not just a puff of cloud. When the angle let a breath of sunlight catch it, there was a subtle texture like brushed metal, dulled. My phone, tucked behind the yoke as a backup camera, was on a sputtering live app I'd tested once for a training piece. I thumbed it, but the app froze. The live feed pixelated and then smudged into blocks. I shoved it back. There's a tidy, ridiculous paranoia that comes with that. I kept imagining I'd suddenly gone blind to the rest of the world, and whatever was at my wing was the only thing that noticed I was there. Then it did the thing that unstitched me. It snapped upward. I don't mean climbed rapidly in a way I can quantify. I mean it shot from our altitude to above the cloud deck in a motion that was more a disappearance than acceleration, the way a cardiogram line plunges flat. One instant, the pale slant filled my peripheral vision. The next it had gone, and where it threaded the clouds, there was no contrail, no turbulence, nothing to mark the path. Radar replay later showed no primary blip. The controller's voice cut in as if on cue. Say your status? I could hear the slight pitch in her tone now, the professional calibration smelling like concern that's been told to behave. Traffic's gone, I said, my voice low. No visual. Affirm, Mark. No targets on radar. Are you declaring an emergency? I hadn't, and I kept myself from doing it because that would summon a set of procedures and people, and I wasn't sure what problem I was calling. I told them I was okay and would continue VFR to the airport. I circled on the expected arrival, did my checklists out loud because pilots do that to keep the machine of actions moving, and watched the cloud bank where the shape had vanished as if it might leak the thing back out. There are mundane ways this could have been explained. A reflection on a lens, a trick of low sun on the edge of cloud, some kind of experimental unmanned thing with stealth tech. But the evidence wasn't tidy. The instruments didn't glitch long enough to be comprehensible. The radar at 2 different centers logged nothing. My own handheld camera unreadably corrupted the frames it tried to take, and the pigeons I saw the day before at the field looked nowhere near as ruffled as I felt. On the ground, the maintenance guys were sympathetic but standard issue skeptical. They asked if I'd filed a report. I filed one with the flight service desk more out of habit than hope. The controller emailed me the radar replay they could share, a flat gray line, planes where they ought to be, a blank space where my brain insisted the thing had been. The replay showed a 9-second smear of noise in one sector, then clean data. The log for the frequency showed my transmission and the short pause where the controller indexed a query and then normal chatter. There were no UFO show headlines in the morning paper, just a brief note in the airport maintenance log about a pilot reporting unidentified traffic. I drove home through a fog that had moved into the valley, hands warm on the steering wheel, and tried to sleep that night by counting the checklist items for an approach over and over because it steadies me. I told a handful of pilot friends, and their faces slid into the professional tolerance for the strange and then back. One of them, Lisa, who flies charters out of the coast, said people see weird things sometimes, bright objects, reflections, lights, and she shrugged in the way of someone who knows the margin for error in eyes and instruments. Another sent me a clip of a Chinese research paper about radar anomalies over mountain ranges, but admitted it didn't quite match. What stays with me isn't a sensation of cosmic terror. It's the specific ordinariness of it, the prop, the needles, the hum of breath in the headset. The thing had been precise in its wrongness. The most practical fact is this. I flew the plane back, logged my time, did the squawk test, and walked away with my logbook the same, my passengers none the wiser. No one was harmed. I came home, drank too much coffee, and looked out the kitchen window at the sky until it was daylight and normal. I don't have a neat ending. The radar file I was sent is a flat line with a small notch of static where my words met their blanks. The camera files are corrupted in a way that leaves me with a smeared frame in the middle of a clear take. People I told either ask practical questions or smile in a way that says, "Pilot stories are full of weather." I keep thinking about the way it matched my turn, the way it climbed without passing through the wake, the exactness of its timing. I fly again, because the job and because flying is what I know how to do when the sky feels otherwise. I was out checking the north fence when the light hit. It wasn't a headlight or a flashlight. 1 second, the night was the usual dark. The barn a black shape, the pines a darker line. And then someone pulled a curtain of white across the field. It swept from my left to my right, quick and bright enough to make me suck air. My cigarette went dead between my fingers. My flashlight blinked and died. For a breath, I couldn't see the gravel under my boots. When my eyes cleared, the cows were all standing still, every one of them. They were near the north fence, all heads turned the same way, toward the ridge. Not chewing, not swatting flies, not shifting weight. Even the calves were statues. It was wrong, the kind of wrong that makes the back of your neck prickle. I walked out to them. Mabel, my old brown cow, stood with her mouth half open like she'd paused mid-chew. Her hide was warm, she breathed. When I put my hand on her flank, she blinked and went back to grazing, but the rest stayed like that for a long minute. I circled the group, looking for a reason, a light, a person, a glow. But there was nothing past the fence except the marsh, the pines, and a sky full of stars. I went back to the house and told myself it was a trick, headlights off the county road, or a reflection. I couldn't explain the flashlight dying or the way the light had washed out the whole world. Anna slept through it. She worked nights sometimes, and her sleep was deep. I lay awake most of the night thinking about those cow heads pointing like soldiers. 2 nights later, it happened again. I was at the kitchen table doing the books. The clock read 2:14 a.m. The dogs were whining and then silent. The light came from the west this time, a broad white sweep that filled the yard and went across the pasture in 3 even strokes. The radio on the counter, old AM, mostly static, cut to dead silence when the light touched it. The dogs started to bark and then went quiet mid-bark. My flashlight went dead on the table. The little LED blinked out as if someone had taken the battery away. Outside, the cows were clustered by the fence, heads all turned north again. Their tails hung lifeless. I stood barefoot in the grass, heart hammering. There was a low sound then, a layered hum that didn't belong to anything I knew. It pressed in my chest like being underwater. The light pulsed a few times, soft like breathing. The cows didn't move. The dogs crouched and whined. I felt like the world had been put on hold. When the light slid off the ridge, they all collapsed to their knees for a second, then sprung up and rushed toward the barn like something told them to. No one was hurt. They were spooked, but fine. The neighbors, Lee and two others, came over in trucks. Nobody had seen anyone or anything. Phones showed normal battery levels then. Later, some told me their GPS had jumped around for a bit that night. We all talked about it for a week. Someone said they'd found a round patch of flattened grass out by County Road 7. Another said their kid's toy compass had spun funny. A vet came and checked the herd after I found a calf with some slick, wet, matted hair on its shoulder. He said it looked like sap or mud and didn't worry him. The sheriff took a report and nodded the way sheriffs do when people tell odd stories. It didn't stop with cows. Once I drove by the ditch and saw 3 deer standing rigid, necks extended, staring toward the pines. The dogs sometimes froze mid-bark and refused to move. Radios and clocks hiccuped, small things, then righted themselves. I set a cheap phone on a bale of hay one night to film. The battery was full when I started. By morning, the file was corrupted. The timestamp jumped. There was a blank 10 minutes of nothing where the image went white, and the audio was gone. When the clip resumed, the cows were standing. The file offered nothing else. People got used to it. Not used like acceptance, but used like you get used to a bad road, you work around it. We kept spare batteries in the barn and a light on the silo that stayed burning all night. Anna started leaving the bedroom window cracked because the small, steady hiss of air on the screen helped her sleep. We had to get hay in and keep the fences mended. Life pushes you back into routine. I walked the ridge once in the frost before dawn because I couldn't help myself. The grass shimmered, and the sky was a dull coin color. I stood where the first sweep had come from and looked for footprints or scorch marks. There were prints, shoe prints, heading toward the marsh and then stopping at the drainage, like someone had stepped off the edge. They were boot prints, wide and straight, and ended in a tidy fan of muck. I kept that detail to myself because people like tidy answers, and there was nothing tidy about the rest. Mostly there was the light and the way everything, electronics, animals, even time, seemed to hiccup. The cows would line up again at odd hours. Once, late in August, they stood facing the fence for 2 hours while dawn leaped up and a fog rose off the marsh. I sat in the truck and watched them breathe until my hands went numb. Small, strange things piled up. A set of tire tracks in the hay with no corresponding vehicle. A calf that stopped nursing for an afternoon then went back to normal. My neighbor's kid said the moon looked funny one night, like it had a smear across it. I didn't have a neat explanation for any of it. I never saw a craft or a creature. There was no tractor with a floodlight, no man with a spotlight. There was only light so bright it blotted out detail, a sound that pressed down in a way that made the dogs stop mid-bark, and animals freezing like someone had hit pause. Most mornings, everything was ordinary again. Hoof prints in mud, warm breath in the barn, radios that came back to life. One morning, months after the first sweep, I found a ring of bent cattails in the marsh. Stems broken low and splayed out in a perfect circle, maybe 8 feet across. No scorch marks, no smell. The cows wouldn't go near it. I stood at the edge and a fly landed on my wrist and left. The sky was plain. I went home and made coffee and acted like it was nothing. Sleep got harder. I found myself waking at 3 a.m. and walking the yard, looking for lights where there weren't any. When I went to check the animals, I'd stand by the fence and watch the ridge until my eyes smarted. Once, after a night where every dog on the road kept howling, I woke Anna and she came out in her slippers and just put her hand on my shoulder. She didn't ask for details. We didn't have a language for it, besides, "Did you see it?" which meant either yes or no. We started leaving the kitchen light on more often. At the feed store, a man I didn't know came up and said, half joking, half afraid, that his boy had seen the field glow over at the old Miller place, and the whole herd had faced the road like they were listening. Folks swapped small reports in a way that made them less raw. That didn't make what I saw less real. It just made it someone's story, too. I tried to be practical. I kept logs, a stupid notebook in the glove compartment, dates, times, weather, which cows looked, what died or glitched. The journal felt silly and sacred all at once. There were more blanks in it than anything. Nights where I wrote down a blank and left it at that. The more I wrote, the more the pattern teased itself into a shape I couldn't quite name. People in town called it the white sweep and cracked jokes to make it smaller. Jokes are a way to keep from being the one who looks worried. We learned to check the cows more at night. I kept a light on in the barn and a rifle under the seat of the truck because it felt like an option. Now, when night comes, sometimes the light sweeps, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the cows stop and stare the way they did those first nights. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes radios hiccup and dogs go silent and a cheap phone file corrupts. I don't pretend to have an answer. I have the field, the ridge, and the way a white wash can make everything pause for a bit and then go on as if it had never been moved. I carry that image with me when I go out to fix a fence or roll a bale. It isn't a tidy story. I was mowing the lawn that Saturday. It was early evening, late summer, still hot enough that sweat soaked through my shirt in the first 10 minutes. I remember because I almost decided to leave the yard for another day, but the grass had already gotten a little wild, and my neighbor Greg kept dropping hints about it. I figured I'd just push through, get it done before dark. The mower was loud, steady, the usual low rumble and vibration that numbs your hands after a while. I'd gotten halfway through the backyard when I noticed something. At first, I thought it was the mower itself, some kind of mechanical issue, but then I realized it was a different sound layered over it. This low, humming, steady, almost like a single musical note being held. I cut the mower engine to check it. The hum didn't stop. It wasn't the kind of sound you could point to. It didn't come from the fence line or the street or the neighbor's air conditioner. It was just there. The weirdest part was how it seemed to press down on me, like the air was vibrating. My first thought was maybe it was a plane, but the sky was completely clear, just pale blue fading toward orange near the horizon. No clouds, no contrails, nothing. I stood there a long moment, shading my eyes, waiting for something to show itself. The hum went on and on. Then it cut out, just like someone had flipped a switch. I felt stupid standing there, staring at nothing, so I yanked the mower cord again and kept going. But it didn't feel right. The whole time I pushed across the yard, I kept glancing up, scanning the sky for some explanation. At one point, I checked my watch, 6:42. The sun was still well above the trees, so I figured I had about an hour of light left. I made it maybe 3 more passes across the yard before I noticed the hum again, louder this time. I killed the mower instantly. The hum filled the space. I swear I could feel it in my chest, like standing too close to a speaker. I craned my neck back, squinting. The sky was empty, not a bird, not a cloud, just open air. And then I blinked. Or at least that's what it felt like, just one normal blink. But when I looked down at my watch again, it said 7:21. I froze. I remember staring at the numbers, convinced I'd misread them. I tapped the face of the watch, turned my wrist to the light. No, 40 minutes had gone by. 40 minutes that felt like maybe 2. The sun had dipped much lower, casting the yard in this dull orange glow. I didn't understand. I stood there in my yard, mower half pushed through a strip of tall grass, trying to piece it together. I didn't remember standing still that long. I didn't feel lightheaded or faint. There wasn't any gap in my memory. It just jumped. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the watch was wrong? I pulled my phone from my pocket. Same time, 7:21. The hum had stopped again. The silence was thick, like my ears were ringing even though there was no sound. I tried to keep working, just to force myself back into something normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I rushed through the rest of the yard, barely looking at what I was cutting, then rolled the mower into the shed and stood there, breathing hard. Inside the house, the clock on the microwave matched my watch and phone. 40 minutes, unaccounted for. Later that night, I asked Greg casually if he'd heard anything weird outside earlier. Planes, sirens, maybe a generator. He looked at me blankly and said no, he'd been grilling on the deck most of the evening. The next morning, I went out to check the yard. The mower lines were uneven, sloppy, not my usual. I could see exactly where I'd rushed through it. And in the middle of the back lawn, there was this odd patch. Not a burn mark, not flattened grass, just a circle where the blades looked slightly lighter, as if they'd been sun-bleached compared to the rest. I crouched down and ran my hand over it. The ground felt warm, even though it was still early and the rest of the yard was cool with dew. I stood up fast, wiped my palm on my shorts, and didn't touch it again. I never figured out what happened with those missing 40 minutes. The watch kept working fine afterward. The phone, too. But every time I mow now, I catch myself glancing up at the sky,